She had been a nurse for 6 years. She had kept her head down, done her work, and never once asked anyone to look at her twice. So when Commander Roland Briggs stepped into the center of the orientation hall at Caldwell Military Medical Center and brought his open hand across her face in front of 43 witnesses, Nurse Mara Voss did not scream. She did not stumble. She did not cry. She absorbed it. She steadied herself. And she looked at him with eyes so flat and so still that several people in the room later said it was the most unsettling thing they had ever seen. Not the slap, but what came after it. The nothing. What those 43 witnesses did not know was that before Mara Voss became a nurse, she had spent 9 years operating in environments most military officers never heard of and would never be cleared to know about. And Commander Roland Briggs had just made the worst mistake of his career. If you're watching this right now, stay with me until the very end, because this story only gets bigger from here. If this kind of story is what you want more of, hit subscribe, drop a like, and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this goes. The day started the way most days at Caldwell started. Too early, too loud, and already behind schedule. Caldwell Military Medical Center sat on the outer edge of Harwick, Virginia, where the suburbs gave way to federal land and the traffic moved in slow, defeated loops around a base that had been expanding faster than its infrastructure for the past 8 years. The facility was one of the largest military hospitals on the eastern seaboard, with 3 trauma wings, 2 surgical towers, and a reputation for being the kind of place where careers were either made fast or destroyed quietly. Mara Voss had been assigned to Caldwell 11 months ago, transferred from a smaller outpatient clinic in Linmore after a departmental restructuring that nobody had explained clearly, and that she had not fought. She was 38 years old, compact in the way of someone who had spent years needing to move quickly through tight spaces, with short dark hair and a stillness about her that made some of her colleagues mildly uncomfortable in the way that competent people sometimes do. She worked the level 2 trauma floor. She was good at her job. She was, by every measurable standard, unremarkable, which was exactly the way she had engineered it. The orientation session that morning was mandatory for all clinical staff with updated certification requirements. Mara had almost skipped it. She had her recertification documents, she had submitted them on time, and she knew the content the way she knew her own heartbeat. But the department head, a cautious woman named Dr. Celine Okafor, had sent a reminder that read more like a warning, and Mara had decided attendance was simpler than explanation. The hall was a wide room on the ground floor of the administrative building, with folding chairs arranged in loose rows and a projection screen at the front that was already displaying a slide with the wrong font. People filed in gradually. Nurses, orderlies, 2 residents still in scrubs from the overnight, a handful of administrative staff who looked like they were attending under protest. Mara took a seat near the back, second row from the wall. She set her coffee on the floor beside her chair, pulled out a pen she didn't plan to use, and waited for it to start. Commander Roland Briggs arrived 9 minutes late. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and knew it. He had been chief of clinical operations at Caldwell for 3 years, a position that sat above the department heads in the administrative chain, and that gave him authority over staffing, scheduling, resource allocation, and, in practice, the general atmosphere of the facility. He walked into a room the way some people drove on highways, like the other lanes where courtesies extended to him. He went directly to the front without acknowledgement or apology for the delay. He picked up the presentation remote, clicked past the font-wrong slide, and began. For the first 20 minutes, it was unremarkable. Updated reporting protocols, new incident documentation requirements, a brief section on recertification timelines that Mara could have delivered herself. She kept her eyes forward and her posture easy, the pen loose in her hand. Then Briggs stopped. He looked at his tablet. Then he looked up, scanning the room with the specific expression of someone who has found a name on a list and is deciding what to do with it. "Voss," he said. "Mara Voss." She raised her hand slightly. "Here." He found her in the back row and held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. "Step up here." The room shifted. Not dramatically. A few people exchanged glances. Someone straightened in their chair, but the shift was there. Mara noticed it the way she noticed most things, quietly and completely. She stood and walked to the front. Her coffee stayed on the floor. Her face stayed neutral. Briggs gestured at the screen, where a personnel document had appeared. Her recertification file. She recognized the format. "You submitted your documentation late," he said. "I submitted it on the 14th. The deadline was the 15th. The internal deadline was the 12th. The official deadline was the 15th. That's what the system shows and what the department confirmation email states." Briggs looked at her the way people look at something they've decided to make an example of. The internal deadline exists for administrative processing. When staff ignore it, it creates bottlenecks for everyone else. "I wasn't notified of an internal deadline. It's in the staff handbook. It wasn't in the version distributed at onboarding 11 months ago. I checked this morning." A beat. Around the room, people had stopped pretending to look at their phones. Briggs set down the remote. He took a half step toward her, close enough that it was a posture decision, not an accidental one. "You have a habit of arguing, Voss?" "I have a habit of being accurate." What happened next was fast. Not in the way that accidents are fast, unplanned, chaotic, but in the way that certain acts of deliberate cruelty are fast, performed by people who have done similar things before and have never had to answer for them. His right hand came up in a cross. The sound it made in the open room was very loud. Several people flinched. One person made a sound that was almost a word and stopped short of becoming one. The force of it turned her head to the right. She felt the heat bloom across her cheekbone, felt the exact geometry of where his palm had connected, cataloged it the way she cataloged most things that happened to her body, as data, as information, as something to be processed and addressed in due time. She turned her head back. She looked at him. Roland Briggs in that moment was still holding his expression from before, the one that said he was in charge of this conversation, this room, this situation. But something behind it flickered, something registered, because the woman standing in front of him was not reacting the way women in her position were supposed to react. She was not stepping back. She was not raising a hand to her face. She was not filling with tears or apology or shock. She was looking at him the way a person looks at something they have already categorized and moved past. "You need to leave," he said. "Pack your station. HR will contact you about your status." "On what grounds?" "Insubordination." "You'll want to make sure that's documented correctly," she said, and her voice was the same it had been when she'd told him about the deadline. Flat, even, accurate. "Given that there are 43 people in this room," he pointed toward the door. Mara Voss walked to the back row, picked up her coffee from the floor, and walked out of the room. She did not slam the door. The floor of the Level 2 trauma wing was, as it almost always was at 9 in the morning, barely contained chaos. 2 post-op patients needed vital checks, a discharge was backed up waiting for transport coordination, and the saline supply for room 7 had been shorted by central supply for the 3rd time that week. Mara walked into the middle of it, set her coffee down at the nurse's station, and spent the next 40 minutes finishing what she'd started before the mandatory session. Yolanda Fitch found her in the supply corridor at 9:52. Yolanda was a charge nurse with 11 years at Caldwell, a woman who had the institutional knowledge of the place stored in her body, the way longtime soldiers carry their service, not as pride exactly, but as density. She was holding a folded document, and her expression said she wished she were holding something else. "I need you to sit down with me," Yolanda said. "I'm standing." "Mara, whatever it says, I can read it standing." Yolanda unfolded the document. It was a suspension notice printed on HR letterhead and signed by someone named Associate Director of Personnel, whose name Mara didn't recognize. The grounds listed were conduct unbecoming of clinical staff and failure to comply with administrative directives. Effective immediately. Pending review. Mara read it twice. Then she handed it back. "They're saying you argued with Briggs in a public setting," Yolanda said, "that you disrupted the session and refused a direct instruction." "He struck me." Yolanda's jaw tightened. "I know. You know because you were in the room. I know." She said it with the weight of someone who understood exactly what she was not doing. "I need you to go through security with your badge. This is... Mara, I'm sorry. This is how they want it processed." "Who's handling the review?" "Internal Conduct Board. Briggs chairs the preliminary panel." Mara looked at her for a long moment. "He chairs his own review." "He requested it. His authority level allows it under the administrative charter. Yolanda looked like the sentence tasted bad. It's not right. I want you to know I know that. That's useful, Mara said, and meant it without edge. Yolanda knowing mattered, even if what Yolanda was able to do with that knowledge was nothing at all. She took her badge from her pocket and held it out. I'll check out through security. Mara, it's okay, she said. I've been in worse rooms than this. She meant it literally. Yolanda didn't know that, and there was no reason to explain. Mara drove home to the apartment she'd been renting in Harwick for almost a year, a third-floor unit in a building that was fine in the way that serviceable things are fine. Clean, functional, designed by someone who had not been thinking about the people who would actually live there. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee, which was cold now, and did not drink it. She was thinking about the 43 people in the room. She had counted automatically, the way she counted most things: exits, positions, potential variables. 43 witnesses to a man in a position of institutional authority, striking a subordinate in a professional setting. 43 people who had seen it clearly, who had heard the sound, who had watched the entire preceding exchange. And not one of them had said a word before she was walked out. She was not angry about that. She understood it. People in those positions did the math quickly and decided the cost of speaking was greater than the cost of silence. And they were frequently correct because the systems they were calculating within had been built specifically to make that math come out that way. She pulled out her phone and sent a text to a number she hadn't used in 14 months. The text said, "Situation developing, not requesting intervention, informational only." She set the phone on the table and stared at the ceiling for a while. 20 minutes later, the phone buzzed. The reply was 2 words: understood, watching. The next morning, Caldwell Military Medical Center had a different quality to it. Not louder exactly, but denser. The kind of density that comes when something has happened, and the official position is that nothing has happened, and everyone is navigating the gap between those two facts simultaneously. In the trauma wing break room, the conversation stopped and restarted 3 times before Yolanda Fitch walked in, and the remaining 2 nurses found reasons to be somewhere else. In the administrative building, Roland Briggs arrived at his office to find a calendar notification about a preliminary review session that he had scheduled himself and signed his own name to, which he regarded with the satisfaction of a man who had done this kind of thing before and found it reliable. In the records department on the 2nd floor, a woman named Petra Hollis was doing something that did not appear on any of her official duties for the day. Petra was a records coordinator, 44 years old, who had been at Caldwell for 7 years and who had, over the course of those 7 years, developed the specific kind of institutional awareness that comes from being a person who handles documents that other people consider too administrative to pay attention to. She knew where things were filed. She knew which filing categories were used infrequently enough that their contents accumulated without regular audit. She knew the difference between a file that had been misfiled and a file that had been moved with intention. She was looking at the second kind. There was a complaints category, conduct review, subseries C, which nominally covered formal grievances against supervisory staff at the level of department commander and above. It was not a category that saw high traffic, which meant it was not a category that received regular administrative attention. Petra had accessed it 3 times in the past year as part of routine cross-referencing, which meant she had established enough of a pattern that her access log for today would read as continuation rather than anomaly. What she found, when she looked carefully, was that Subseries C for the past 8 years contained 11 files. 4 of them were complete: documentation, investigation record, resolution notation, closure date. The other 7 were shells. They had intake records. They had case numbers. They had the initial complaint documentation, properly formatted, properly dated. They had no investigation records, no resolution, no closure. They had, in 2 cases, a single additional notation, referred for command review, and nothing after. Petra photographed each file with her personal phone, a violation of policy that she was aware of and had decided to commit anyway, and sent them to a personal email address. Then she closed the files, returned the physical folders to their correct positions, and spent the rest of the morning doing her actual job. Mara was in her apartment when her phone rang with a number she didn't know. She almost didn't answer. Then she did. "Miss Voss." A woman's voice. Professional, measured, with the specific economy of language that came from spending years in environments where words cost something. My name is Special Agent Diane Corda. I'm with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. I'd like to speak with you about the events at Caldwell Military Medical Center yesterday morning. Mara sat up straighter without deciding to. How did you get this number? We have very good administrative access, Ms. Voss. A pause. You were separated from your position this morning following an incident that was witnessed by 43 individuals in a professional setting. We're aware of the incident. There's a formal suspension pending review. The Internal Conduct Board convenes in... The Internal Conduct Board is not our concern, Corta said. The conduct of the officer in question is our concern. Specifically, it's been our concern for considerably longer than yesterday. Mara was quiet. I'd like to meet with you, Corta said. Today, if you're available. The specifics of your military service record give your account a degree of legal and institutional weight that makes your testimony relevant to a matter we've been building for some time. Mara looked at the wall across from where she sat. Through the window, she could hear a car engine in the street below. She thought about the text she'd sent the night before. She thought about 43 people who hadn't moved. Where do you want to meet? She said. They met at a municipal building downtown that Corta had access to through a jurisdictional arrangement Mara didn't ask about. The room was plain and institutional, with a rectangular table and 4 chairs and a window that looked at a parking structure. Corta was a woman in her late 40s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a presence that suggested she had spent a significant portion of her career in rooms like this one and had stopped finding them remarkable. With her was a younger man named Agent Rourke, who took notes and said almost nothing. You understand this conversation is being recorded, Corta said. Yes. And you're speaking voluntarily. Yes. Cort opened a folder. Inside it, Mara could see documents printed on government-grade paper, the kind with the weight to it. Your military record is partially classified. I want to be clear that I'm not going to ask you about anything related to your classified service. What I'm going to ask about is the incident yesterday morning and your general experience at Caldwell over the past 11 months. Okay. Has Commander Briggs interacted with you prior to yesterday? 3 times. Twice in passing at departmental briefings. Once directly, 6 months ago, when he came to the floor to question a staffing decision my charge nurse had made. He spoke over her to address her supervisory decisions to me, which I redirected. Corta wrote something. Redirected how? I told him the staffing decision had been charge nurse Fitch's to make, and that any concerns about it should be addressed to her. How did he respond? He looked at me for a moment and then addressed her. Corta nodded. Were there other staff present at Caldwell who, to your knowledge, had concerns about Commander Briggs's conduct? Mara thought about how to answer this precisely. I was aware of discomfort. People don't always name what they're uncomfortable about. But you were aware. Yes. Cort closed the folder. She took off her glasses entirely and set them on the table, which seemed to be a deliberate gesture, a signal that she was about to say something that was not procedural. Ms. Voss, we've been investigating Roland Briggs for 14 months. What happened yesterday accelerated our timeline because it gave us something we didn't have before. 43 witnesses, Mara said. 43 witnesses, Corta confirmed, and specifically a witness with your record who can speak to the incident from a position of documented competence that makes the encounter impossible to reframe as ambiguous. She paused. He's done this before. We believe he's done this many times. We have some of the documentation. We're working to find more. Mara thought about Petra Hollis, though she didn't know Petra's name yet. She thought about the 7 incomplete files she would later learn about. She thought about the women who had reported things to a system that had filed their words in a folder and closed the drawer. What do you need from me? She said. Your formal statement, your cooperation with the investigation, and your willingness to have your military record partially disclosed in a federal proceeding should this go that far. Corta's expression didn't change. Given what's in that record, it would change the character of this case significantly. Mara was quiet for a moment. It'll go that far, she said finally. Not as a prediction, as an assessment. Corta looked at her steadily. I think so too. That evening, Mara drove back past Caldwell. She didn't stop. She didn't have any reason to stop. Her badge had been turned in, Her access was suspended, and the building's security cameras would log any registered vehicle that entered the lot. She just drove past it on the access road that ran along the facility's eastern perimeter, watching the lit windows of the trauma wing in her peripheral vision. She knew which windows were which. She had memorized the floor layout in her second week, the way she memorized most physical spaces, not obsessively, just as a habit of attention that had been useful enough, often enough, that she'd stopped questioning it. The window at the far left of the second floor, the one with the slight tilt in the blinds, was room 14. The bright cluster of 3 near the stairwell was the nursing station. Someone up there was having a rough night. Someone was doing the work she was currently suspended from doing. She thought about what Corda had said. 14 months of investigation. A case that had been building while Mara was on that floor, walking past the incomplete files she hadn't known to look for, redirecting Roland Briggs toward a charge nurse he'd been trying to dismiss, while women she'd never met had submitted formal complaints to a system that had erased them. She had known that systems like this existed. She had operated inside and alongside institutions for most of her adult life, and she was not the kind of person who held illusions about the relationship between formal processes and actual accountability. She understood how these things worked. She had, on 3 separate occasions in her previous career, watched things work exactly this way and been unable to do anything other than document it and add it to a record that went somewhere she didn't have access to. This time was different. This time she had been in the room. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her. A Harwick number she didn't recognize. She answered it. Mara. A man's voice. Low, controlled, with the particular register of someone accustomed to being listened to. This is General Warren Slate. I apologize for the hour. Her hand stayed steady on the wheel. She knew that name. She hadn't heard it in 4 years, not since a debrief in a building she was not going to think about right now. And General Slate had been a brigadier then, and she had been something other than a nurse. General, she said, I'm going to be in Harwick in 36 hours, he said. I need you to know that before anything else happens. I need you to know that things are in motion that are larger than what you can currently see from where you're standing. How much larger? A pause that was not hesitation. It was the pause of someone choosing exactly how much to say. Larger than one commander, he said. Larger than one facility. Another pause. Sit tight, Lieutenant. You've done the right things. Keep doing them. The line went quiet. Mara sat in the parked car on the dark access road, watching the lit windows of a hospital she was not allowed to enter, and thought about 36 hours and what they would carry into Harwick when they arrived. Somewhere on the second floor, a call light had come on in room 14. She could see it from here, the faint pulse of yellow through the tilted blinds, steady and insistent, demanding attention that someone else was going to have to give. She put the car in drive. She was not done with that building, not even close. She drove home with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. 36 hours. General Warren Slate had said 36 hours like it was a gift, and maybe it was, but it was also a span of time she had to get through first, and getting through it meant not doing the things she wanted to do, which included going back into Caldwell and pulling those incomplete complaint files herself and laying them on someone's desk where they could not be refiled or rerouted or made to disappear again. She didn't do that. She went home, made food she didn't taste, and slept in 4-hour segments the way she'd trained herself to sleep in places where longer wasn't an option. The next morning, her phone had 6 missed calls. 3 were from numbers she didn't recognize. 1 was from Yolanda Fitch. 1 was from a local news station, which she deleted. And 1 was from an area code she hadn't seen in years, a Virginia extension that belonged to a legal office operated by a nonprofit that specialized in military personnel rights cases. She called Yolanda first. Yolanda picked up on the second ring and spoke before Mara could. I need you to know that 2 other nurses have already gone to HR, independently. They went this morning without coordinating with each other, and I know that because I was standing there when the second one came in, and the first one was still sitting in the waiting area. She took a breath. Briggs is going to try to make this about your conduct. He's already circulated something internally, some kind of memo about professional standards. I've seen it. It references you by name. What does it say? That you demonstrated a pattern of insubordination. and that yesterday's incident was the result of escalating behavior that had been formally noted in your file. There's nothing formally noted in my file. I've been reviewed twice in 11 months, both times satisfactory. I know that, Yolanda said, which means the notation is new, which means it was added after the fact. Mara was quiet for a moment, turning that over. It was not surprising. It was in fact exactly the kind of move that made sense in a situation like this. Not intelligent exactly, but reflexive. The institutional version of covering your hands after something bad had already happened. The problem was, it left a timestamp. Who else saw the memo? Department heads at minimum, probably wider. It came through the command distribution list. Save it, Mara said. If you have a copy, save it somewhere that isn't on the Caldwell network. A pause. Mara, I know what I'm asking. Only do it if you're willing to. She paused. You don't owe me anything. Yolanda made a sound that was not quite a laugh. I've been a nurse here for 11 years. I've watched this happen to people before. I owe somebody something. The line shifted. I'll keep a copy. After she hung up, Mara called the Virginia legal office. The attorney who answered was a woman named Harriet Sue, who had a calm, methodical way of speaking that Mara found immediately credible. Harriet Sue had been notified of the incident at Caldwell by a colleague. She didn't say who, and Mara didn't ask, and had been attempting to reach Mara since the previous afternoon. You've already spoken with the IG's office, Harriet said. It wasn't a question. Yesterday, Agent Corta. Good. I want to be clear that my role and theirs are separate. The IG is conducting a federal investigation. I represent your interests specifically, including your employment rights, your civil protections, and any civil legal action that may arise from the assault. She paused to let that land. What happened to you in that room yesterday morning is, under Virginia Code and under federal statutes governing military and government-affiliated medical facilities, a criminal act performed by a superior officer in front of witnesses. It's not a gray area. Briggs has circulated a memo retroactively characterizing my conduct as a pattern of insubordination. When was it dated? I don't know yet. Yesterday afternoon at the earliest. Then we'll request the metadata, Harriet said, with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. Document creation timestamps are recoverable. If it was created after the incident and backdated, that's an additional offense. She paused again. Ms. Voss, I want to ask you directly. Do you understand that this situation has the potential to become significantly public? Mara looked out the window at the parking lot below, where an older man was loading grocery bags into his car with the methodical care of someone doing the same thing he'd done every Tuesday for 30 years. I understand that. And you're not going to ask me to keep it quiet. No. Good, Harriet Sue said, in a tone that was almost warm. Because I wasn't going to be able to do that anyway. By that afternoon, something had shifted at Caldwell in the way that things shift when a story has moved beyond the people who started it. It wasn't visible in any official way. The hallways were the same. The clinical operations continued. Patients were moved and monitored and discharged and admitted, and the machinery of the facility ground on with the indifference to individual drama that large institutions maintain as a survival mechanism. But underneath that surface, in the break rooms and the supply corridors, and the brief unrecorded exchanges between people who passed each other 6 times a day, something was moving. People were talking, not openly. The Briggs memo had traveled fast, and the memo was a signal, not about Mara specifically, but about what the command's posture was going to be, about which version of events was being constructed and how quickly it was being built. The people who read that signal correctly were the people who had been at Caldwell long enough to know that the speed of the construction was proportional to the size of what was being covered. A minor conduct dispute didn't generate a facility-wide memo by the following morning. A minor conduct dispute didn't require a preemptive narrative. In the records department, Petra Hollis had said nothing to anyone about what she'd done with her phone the day before. She'd sent the photographs to a personal email, accessed it at home on her personal laptop, and then forwarded the files to an address she had located through a method she was not going to describe to anyone in this building. She had gone about her day, returned the physical folders to their positions, and spent the evening in a state of controlled anxiety that she managed by cleaning her kitchen with unusual thoroughness. She did not know whether anything would come of it. She did know that she had looked at those 7 incomplete files, and at the dates on the intake records, 2017, 2018, 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2023. And she had done the math that any reasonable person would do. 7 complaints, 7 case numbers, 7 women who had put their words into a system that was supposed to carry them somewhere, and the system had eaten them. She had kept her head down for 7 years. She had been careful and professional, and she had been good at her job, and she had done the reasonable thing, which was to not get involved in things that were above her pay grade. And she had watched, at a careful distance, as the reasonable thing had produced exactly the results it always produced, which was that the people who needed protecting were not protected, and the people who needed stopping were not stopped. She was done with this reasonable thing. At 3:15 in the afternoon, an email arrived in the IG office's tip intake system that contained 7 photographic attachments. Special Agent Diane Court's team had already been working through Caldwell's administrative records via a formal document request that had been filed that morning. The photographs from Petra Hollis got there first. Corda looked at the intake date on the oldest file and said nothing for a moment. Then she said to Agent Rourke, "Get me everything we have on the command review process for this facility going back to 2015. Rourke looked at the photograph on her screen. "That's 8 years of records." "I know how long it is," Corta said, and picked up her phone. Mara spent the rest of that day doing the things available to her, which were limited in number but not in importance. She wrote out a complete account of every interaction she'd had with Roland Briggs. Dates, times, witnesses, the exact words she could recall, the body language she'd cataloged, the ways in which the patterns she'd observed had accumulated into something that had a shape. She wrote it in the same way she'd written operational reports, which was not creatively but precisely, without speculation, without editorializing, with the specific kind of compressed clarity that came from years of producing documents where inaccuracy had consequences. She sent the document to Harriet Sue. She sent a copy to Corda. She kept a copy on a personal drive that she stored in a place that was not her apartment. Then she made a second document, separate and shorter, that she didn't send to anyone. It was a list of the things she'd noticed in 11 months at Caldwell that she hadn't reported, hadn't acted on, hadn't been in a position to do anything concrete about, not because she hadn't cared, but because you cannot build a case on noticing. You can only build a case on documentation, on corroboration, on the specific kind of proof that can survive the kind of institutional pressure that was already, right now, being assembled against her. She looked at the list for a long time after she finished it. Then she opened her laptop and found everything publicly available about Roland Briggs's career history. He'd moved through 4 facilities in 14 years, which was not unusual for military medical administrators, but the timing of each transfer was worth noting. 2 of them had come in the year following periods of elevated administrative review activity. Not discipline, just review. The kind of elevated activity that didn't show up as formal action, but that showed up in transition patterns if you knew how to look for them. She'd known people like Briggs before. Not specifically, not by name, but as a type. Men who had learned to operate within institutional structures, because institutional structures were built to protect their own architecture first and the people inside them second. They moved. They transferred. The complaints followed them and then stopped following them when they crossed into a new chain of command, a new administrative territory, a new set of people who didn't have the history and weren't asking the right questions yet. Until something happened in front of 43 witnesses and an attorney got a DNA match on a document's creation timestamp and an anonymous records coordinator photographed 7 years of buried files on her personal phone. Mara closed the laptop. She was not patient by nature. Patience was something she had acquired because it was useful, the way she had acquired a lot of things, not because she'd wanted to, but because the alternative was worse. She sat with it now the way she sat with most difficult things, directly, without flinching, acknowledging what it cost. 36 hours, Slate had said. She checked the time. She was down to 22, so the second night was harder, not for any specific reason she could have pointed to. The legal situation was moving. The investigation was running. She had representation. She had her account documented. She had people in positions of institutional authority who were, right now, working. There was nothing she needed to do tonight that she hadn't done. What she had instead was the accumulated weight of the day pressing against something she didn't have good language for. Not rage exactly. Rage was something she knew, something with a specific texture and a specific heat, and this wasn't that. It was closer to the feeling she'd had after certain missions that went right. Not relief, because relief was too simple, but a kind of heaviness that came from knowing how close the other version had been, how easily things went the other way. How many times they had gone the other way for other people. She made tea, she didn't drink, and stood at the window looking at the street below. She thought about the 7 women who had filed complaints and gotten nothing. She thought about the shape of what it took to file a formal complaint, the decision to trust a process, the vulnerability of that decision, the specific courage of naming something in a context where naming it gave it power to come back at you. And then nothing. A case number. A folder. Silence. She thought about the nurses at Caldwell who had gone to HR that morning without coordinating with each other. 2 women who had looked at what happened and decided that this time they were going to say something. She didn't know their names. She would probably never know their names. But they had made that decision in the morning in a building where the command had already circulated a memo establishing its position, and that was not nothing. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she now had saved as Harriet Sue. Metadata recovered on Briggs' memo. Created at 11:47 p.m., 2 hours after incident. Submitted to command distribution at 8:03 a.m. following morning. Document modified 4 times between creation and distribution. Your legal team has a copy. Mara read it twice. Then she set the phone face down on the counter and finished standing at the window for a while longer. At some point, she went to bed. At some point, the night moved through its hours and became morning. She was up at 5:30 and running by 5:45. Not because she needed to clear her head, but because she needed her body to do something it knew how to do, and running was easier than most of the other options. She did 5 miles through the neighborhood east of her building, where the streets were quiet and the stoplights were doing their patient, pointless cycling for an audience of no one. When she got back to the apartment, she had a voicemail from a number with a Washington area code. She listened to it once. The voice was not General Slate's, was it? It was younger, female, efficient, and it identified itself as belonging to the office of a congressional liaison to the Senate Armed Services Committee Subcommittee on Military Personnel. The message said that the subcommittee had been made aware of the incident at Caldwell Military Medical Center and that a preliminary inquiry had been opened. It gave a callback number and a name, a staffer named Rowan, and said they'd like to speak with her at her earliest convenience. Mara sat on the floor of her apartment in her running clothes and thought about how fast things moved when the right pieces were in place. She had not put those pieces in place. Or, not exactly. She had sent 1 text to 1 number and made 1 call to a legal office and sat in a room with federal investigators and told the truth. The pieces had been moving before she got to any of them. 14 months of investigation, an IG office that had been building something for over a year, complaints filed by women she didn't know, a records coordinator who had looked at an incomplete file and decided she was done with silence. Mara was not the story. She understood that. She had become a visible point in a story that was much larger than her face, and that visibility served a function she could either use or waste. She was not going to waste it. She called Harriet Sue and told her about the Senate staffer. Harriet was quiet for exactly 3 seconds, which Mara was beginning to understand was the length of Harriet's processing pause. "Do not call that number without me on the line," she said. "We'll set it up as a 3-way. Give me an hour." Tut. They spoke with Rowan at 9:15. Rowan was a woman who spoke the way people spoke when they had a very specific job to do in a very limited window, and had learned that efficiency was a form of respect. She explained that the subcommittee's interest was not in the incident itself. The incident was a matter for the IG's office and the courts, but in the systemic patterns it potentially reflected, in whether what had been documented at Caldwell was representative of what was happening at comparable facilities, in whether the command review process had been functioning as intended, or whether there were structural failures that required legislative attention. "We'd like to include your account in the subcommittee's preliminary review," Rowan said. "Voluntarily and with full legal protection under the Military Whistleblower Protection Act. Your testimony would be submitted as written documentation initially, with the possibility of a formal hearing appearance depending on how the subcommittee's inquiry develops. I'm aware of the whistleblower statutes, Mara said, a pause on Rowan's end that contained a recalibration. Of course. Then you'll know that the protections are comprehensive, including against any retaliatory administrative action. The retaliatory administrative action has already happened, Harriet said, which was the first thing Harriet had said in 11 minutes. Which we are aware of, Rowan said, and which will be factored into the subcommittee's review of the command structure's response to this incident. After they hung up, Harriet stayed on the line for a moment. This just became a significantly larger matter than a civil battery claim. Yes, Mara said. Are you all right with that? Mara thought about the question honestly. All right wasn't quite the right framework. What she was clear. She knew what she was doing and why she was doing it and what it was likely to cost her. That wasn't the same as comfortable, but it was the only version of this that she could have lived inside. Yes, she said. At 11 that morning, Roland Briggs was in his office on the 3rd floor of the administrative building in a meeting with 2 of his staff about a supply procurement issue that he was treating with the attention of a man who had decided the thing everyone was talking about was not worth treating as a serious problem. He was wrong about that. His assistant knocked and opened the door at 11:14. She had the expression of someone delivering news she'd been told to deliver and would rather not be in the room for. Commander, there's a call from the IG's office. They're requesting a formal availability for a recorded interview this week. Briggs looked at her for a moment. Tell them my schedule is committed through Friday. She hesitated. They said to tell you that Friday is acceptable and that your attendance is requested as a matter of official cooperation. There was a difference between requested and required, and Briggs knew it, and he also knew that the distinction was currently the only maneuvering room he had, and that it was getting smaller. He told his assistant to confirm Friday, and went back to the procurement meeting with the air of a man who had everything under control. At 1:15, his deputy, a major named Hal Terrence, appeared in his doorway with a printed document and the look of a person carrying weight they didn't ask for. Terrence had worked under Briggs for 2 years. He was efficient and cautious, and he had, over those 2 years, developed the specific calibration of a person who understood the difference between the things that were his responsibility and the things that were going to land on him if he stayed in the proximity of someone else's problems. The IG's office has sent a formal records preservation notice, Terrence said. All internal communications, personnel files, and administrative records from the past 8 years are under a legal hold. Briggs looked at the document. 8 years. Yes, sir. That's a standard request scope. Terrence said nothing, which was itself an answer. Briggs put the document on his desk and looked at it for a moment. The records hold was not a crisis. It was a process. Processes he had navigated before, twice, at previous facilities, in different forms. He had navigated them by being careful and cooperative, and by trusting the institutional structures around him, which had, both times, absorbed the situation and moved on. The difference, which he had not fully calculated yet, was that those previous situations had not included 7 years of recoverable file modification metadata, a Senate subcommittee inquiry, a records coordinator who had made copies, and a suspended nurse with a classified military background whose legal team had already been in contact with federal investigators for 36 hours. He didn't know about most of those things yet. He would. Mara was at a coffee shop 3 blocks from her apartment when her phone rang again, and this time it was a number she knew, a direct line she had dialed exactly once before, on a base she was not going to name, in a year she preferred not to calculate. Slate, the voice said. Not General Slate, just Slate, the way military people used last names when the weight of the moment didn't require formality. I'm here, she said. 24 hours, not 36. Something moved faster than we anticipated. I'll be at Harwick by 0700 tomorrow. A pause. I need you to know that when I arrive, some things are going to change quickly. What kind of things? The suspension is going to be addressed. The Internal Conduct Board review is going to be superseded. He said it simply, the way you say things that are already decided. And your record, the parts of it that matter to this case, is going to be entered into the federal proceeding. We've had clearance approved for the relevant sections. Mara was quiet for a moment. She had known this was possible. She had consented to it in the room with Corda. It was still a different thing to hear it stated as a fact that was already in motion. That's going to change how people see this situation, she said. That's the idea, Slate said. You've been standing in that building for 11 months as a civilian nurse with a suspension on her record. Effective tomorrow morning, the people in that building are going to understand who they've actually been dealing with. He paused. I know you didn't want it used this way. I didn't want it used anyway. I know. He wasn't apologizing. It wasn't that kind of conversation. The system ran the same calculation it always runs, which is that the people with the least protection absorb the most damage. I'm going to make it harder for the system to run that calculation at Caldwell. Mara looked at her coffee. It was getting cold. And the women who filed those complaints? The 7 who got nothing? That's what Friday is for, Slate said. The IG's interview with Briggs is Friday. Whatever he thinks that conversation is going to be, he's wrong. After she put the phone down, she sat in the coffee shop for a long time without drinking anything. Tomorrow morning, 24 hours. She had spent 11 months at Caldwell as a person nobody looked at closely enough. She had done the work, kept her head down, gotten out of the way of the machinery when she could, and navigated it when she couldn't. She had watched a system function exactly the way systems like it were designed to function, which was to say, in the interest of its own continuity and of the people most positioned to threaten it. She was not angry about that. She was something colder and more useful than angry. She paid for her coffee, walked back to her apartment, and laid out what she needed for the morning. Watts, at 4:47 p.m., 2 floors above the records department at Caldwell Military Medical Center, a patient in room 14 began to deteriorate. His name was Corporal Denny Ashworth, 26 years old, post-op from an emergency appendectomy performed 41 hours earlier. He had been recovering well, vitals stable, pain managed, expected to be discharged in 2 days. The surgery had been textbook. His post-op notes were clean. What his post-op notes did not capture, because it had not been visible on any scan and had not produced symptoms until this moment, was a slow internal bleed from a vessel that had been stressed but not definitively compromised during the procedure. The bleed had been accumulating behind his abdominal wall for the past 18 hours. Not fast enough to trigger the monitors, not producing the specific constellation of symptoms that would have flagged it clearly. Just slowly, quietly filling the space behind his organs while his chart said he was recovering. At 4:47, his blood pressure dropped 7 points in 4 minutes. The nurse at the station, a young man named Patrick, 6 months out of his training program, caught the reading and rechecked it manually. The second reading matched. Patrick looked at the number and felt the specific sensation of not knowing whether what he was seeing was serious or equipment drift or patient movement affecting the reading. He went to the room. Ashworth was awake but looked wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not the kind of wrong that announced itself. The kind of wrong that you only recognized if you knew what you were looking for. His color was off in the way that was easy to explain away. His breathing was slightly shallower than it had been an hour earlier. He said he felt a little tired. Patrick felt tired too at the end of a 12-hour shift, and tired was not a finding. He flagged the attending on the floor. A second-year resident named Marcus, who came, reviewed the vitals, noted the blood pressure dip, attributed it provisionally to positional change and post-op fatigue, ordered an additional monitoring check in 30 minutes, and moved on to the 3 other patients demanding his attention. At 5:14, Ashworth's blood pressure dropped again. Mara's phone buzzed at 5:21. It was Yolanda Fitch, and she was speaking before Mara could say hello. I know you're suspended, and I know I shouldn't be calling you for clinical consultation, but I need someone who has seen more than Marcus has seen, and I need them right now. Her voice was controlled, but Mara had known Yolanda long enough to hear what was under the control. Room 14, post-op, BP dropped twice in 30 minutes, 40 points systolic over an hour. Resident thinks it's positional. I don't think it's positional. Mara was already moving to the other room for her shoes. Has the bleed site been imaged since surgery? 41 hours ago. Clean at the time. Vessels. The operative note says 2 minor stress points were observed and left. Attending judged them below threshold for intervention. Below threshold was a decision, and decisions could be wrong. Get a bedside ultrasound on him right now. Don't wait for imaging to be scheduled. Bedside, portable, now. If the resident, Yolanda, she said her name once, flat. Now. The line was quiet for 1 second. Okay. Mara was pulling on her jacket with the phone still between her shoulder and her ear. She had no clinical authority at Caldwell tonight. She had no badge, no access, no standing. She was a suspended employee with an active conduct review pending a board chaired by the man who had hit her. She got in her car. She was 9 minutes from the hospital. She drove 8 of them before Yolanda called back. "Ultrasound shows free fluid," Yolanda said, and her voice had the flatness of someone who has been right about something and wishes they weren't. "Significant. The resident is calling surgery now." "What's his pressure?" 78/50. Mara pulled into the Caldwell access road. Her badge wouldn't open the main doors. There was a staff entrance on the east side that operated on a different access system, one that took 45 seconds to override if you knew the specific sequence, which she did because she had memorized the facility layout in her second week, and she had noted that as a thing worth knowing. "Tell them I'm coming," she said. "Mara, if security—" "Tell them." She ended the call. The east entrance opened at the second attempt. She moved through the ground floor corridor at the pace that did not attract attention, but covered ground fast, up the stairwell, through the door to level 2. The surgical team was being assembled. She could hear it, the specific frequency of a floor that has shifted from monitoring mode into intervention mode, the change in voice pitch and footstep tempo that meant something was actually happening. She went to room 14. Ashworth was still conscious, which surprised her and shouldn't have. Bleed victims were often conscious until they weren't, the body maintaining function with remarkable stubbornness against conditions it was losing. He was gray-white and sweating lightly, and his eyes tracked her with the confused focus of someone in significant pain. "Hey," she said. "Denny, I'm Nurse Voss. I've been on this floor. How's your breathing?" "Hurts," he said. "Chest. Not my chest, more like your back. Referred pain." She was already moving her hands to his abdomen, not pressing hard, just reading the muscle tension, the guarding response. He was guarding without knowing he was guarding. "You're going to surgery. The team is coming right now." "Is it bad?" She looked at him directly, because he deserved that. "It's serious and they caught it. Those are the two things that matter." The surgical resident, a woman Mara didn't know well, appeared in the doorway with 2 nurses behind her and a portable cart. She looked at Mara for half a second with an expression that was equal parts recognition and calculation. "Voss," she said. "He's guarding upper left quadrant. Referred pain to the back. BP's been dropping in steps, not gradually, which means this is bleeding in intervals, not continuously. Tell your surgeon." The resident looked at her for one more second. Then she turned to her team. "Let's move him." Mara stepped back. She stood in the corridor while they wheeled Denny Ashworth toward the surgical suite. She watched them go. Her hands were still. Her breathing was even. Down the hallway, 2 security officers appeared, walking with the specific gait of people who had been told to do something and were trying to calibrate how much urgency to bring to it. Behind them was a man in a Caldwell administrative badge, who Mara recognized as one of Briggs's staff. She did not move toward them or away from them. She stood where she was, in the corridor of the floor she'd worked for 11 months, and waited for them to reach her. They were 4 doors away when a hand closed around her arm. Not rough, but firm. And she turned to find Yolanda Fitch standing beside her with an expression that contained 11 years of Caldwell and everything that came with it. "He's in surgery," Yolanda said quietly. "I know. You shouldn't be here." "I know." The security officers stopped 2 feet away. The administrative staff member behind them said, "Ms. Voss, you've been formally suspended. You need to leave the premises." Mara looked at him with the same flat attention she'd given Briggs in the orientation hall. Not defiance, not calculation, just the specific quality of someone who has cataloged what is in front of them and is not particularly moved by it. "I'll leave," she said, "when I know he's stable." "You'll leave now." Behind the administrative staff member at the end of the corridor, something changed. The elevator doors opened. And the woman who stepped out of them was not someone Mara had expected to see tonight. She was in her late 40s in civilian clothes with a federal badge on a lanyard and an expression that suggested she was approximately done with today. Special Agent Diane Corda. Beside her was someone Mara did not recognize, a man in uniform, not high rank, a colonel, with the specific posture of someone who has been sent to do something and has been told not to come back until it's done. Corda looked at the scene. Mara against the wall, security officers, the administrative staff member, the corridor. And her expression did not change. She turned to the colonel beside her and said something Mara couldn't hear. The colonel walked forward, past the security officers, past the administrative staff member, until he was standing at a distance from which he did not need to raise his voice. He looked at the administrative staff member and said, "Your Commander Briggs is currently being asked to secure his personal effects from his office. I'd recommend you go assist him with that process rather than being in this corridor right now." The administrative staff member stared at him. "That wasn't a suggestion," the colonel said. In the silence that followed, somewhere beyond the double doors at the end of the hall, Denny Ashworth's surgery had begun. And in his office on the third floor, Roland Briggs was picking up his phone to call his attorney. And in Washington, a subcommittee staffer was forwarding a document to a senator's office. And in the records department, 7 file folders sat in their incorrect positions with their incomplete records and their damning timestamps, waiting for the morning. Mara looked at Corta. Corta looked at her. "General Slate moved the timeline up," Corta said simply. "Again." "Again," Mara repeated. "He decided the situation at Caldwell had developed past the point where waiting was productive." Corta said it without apology or explanation, the way you described weather, something that had happened, not something that required justification. "He'll be here at 0700. Tonight, we're securing the facility's administrative records and ensuring that the personnel actions taken against you in the past 48 hours are formally suspended pending federal review." The security officers had not moved. They were doing the math, 2 of them, a colonel, a federal badge, a corridor that had very suddenly become more complicated than their shift briefing had prepared them for. The administrative staff member was already gone. Mara looked down the hall toward the surgical suite doors. Ashworth was behind them somewhere, on a table, a surgeon working through what she had identified, and what the resident had confirmed and what the monitoring system had missed for 18 hours. She had no way to know how it was going right now. That was the part of medicine she had never fully made peace with, the moment when you handed it off and the outcome moved beyond your reach. "I want to know when he's out of surgery," she said. "I'll make sure someone keeps you informed," Corta said. She turned to the colonel, whose name Mara still didn't have. "I need the administrative floor locked down and I need a secure line to Slate's team." The colonel nodded and moved off. Corta looked back at Mara. "You need to not be in this building tonight." "I know. I mean that practically, not punitively. Everything that happens here in the next 12 hours is going to be part of a federal record. Your presence complicates the chain of custody on anything we access." Mara understood that. She understood it clearly, and it was still an effort to turn and walk back toward the stairwell, past the room where she'd spent 11 months working, past the nursing station where Yolanda Fitch was standing with her arms crossed and an expression that said she had seen enough of this particular day. "Yolanda," Mara said, stopping. "Go," Yolanda said. "I'll call you when he's out." Mara went. She drove home and sat in the dark of her apartment for 4 hours. She did not pace. She did not make calls. She put her phone on the kitchen table face up, and she sat in the chair across from it, and she waited, which was one of the things she was genuinely good at and which cost her something every single time. At 9:41, Yolanda called. "He's out," she said. Surgery took 2 hours and 14 minutes. The bleed was from a vessel branch they hadn't seen on the original imaging, small, stressed, and it had been seeping for the better part of 2 days before it opened enough to register. Surgeon says another 2 to 4 hours, and it was a different outcome. She paused. "He's stable. He's going to be okay." Mara closed her eyes for a moment. "Okay," she said. The surgical resident, Priya, you probably don't know her well. She told the attending that you'd called the presentation correctly. Guarding pattern, referred pain, interval bleeding. She put it in her handoff notes. She didn't have to do that. "No," Yolanda agreed. "She did it anyway." After she hung up, Mara stayed in the chair for a while longer. The specific weight of the past 2 days settled around her in the dark. Not lifting exactly, but redistributing into something she could carry more evenly. Ashworth was stable. The records were locked down. Slate was coming in the morning. She went to sleep at 11 and did not wake until 5. She was running her usual route when the convoy passed her. Not a convoy in the civilian sense, not a parade of marked vehicles with lights and noise. but unmistakably military in the specific way that military presence had of reorganizing the visual logic of a civilian environment. 3 dark SUVs moving at a measured pace through the early morning streets of Harwich, with a 4th vehicle behind them that had federal plates. They were heading east toward the Caldwell access road. Mara watched them pass and kept running. She finished the 5 miles, showered, dressed, and drove to the facility. The entrance to the Caldwell campus looked different at 0700 than it had at any point in the past 11 months. There were 2 military police vehicles at the main gate, not blocking it, but present in the way that said something had changed about who was in charge of this space. The parking lot held the 4 vehicles she'd seen on the road and 3 others she didn't recognize. A small cluster of staff members stood near the building's main entrance, not entering, clearly waiting for information about what was happening to their morning. Mara parked and walked to the entrance. A military police officer stopped her. "Ma'am, this facility is under a temporary administrative hold. Staff access is restricted to essential clinical personnel until further notice." "I'm Mara Voss," she said. "I was told to be here." He checked a list on his tablet. His expression didn't change in the way that trained people's expressions didn't change when they found what they were looking for. "Go ahead." Inside, the administrative building's main lobby had been converted in the way that federal teams converted spaces quickly and without ceremony. Folding tables with laptops, cables running across the floor, 2 people with document boxes moving from the elevator toward a side room. It looked exactly like what it was. A team that had done this before and had a system for it. Harriet Sue was standing near the reception desk with a document folder under her arm and a coffee she appeared to have acquired from somewhere. She spotted Mara and crossed the lobby. "You look like you slept," she said. "Some. Good." She handed Mara a document. "The suspension has been formally vacated as of 0600 this morning under the Federal Personnel Protection Statute. Your access has been restored and the Internal Conduct Board review has been superseded by the federal proceeding. You are, on paper, reinstated pending the outcome of the investigation." Mara read the document. The language was precise and without drama, which she appreciated. "Where's Briggs?" "Administrative leave effective yesterday evening. He was removed from the premises at approximately 9 p.m. under order from the colonel who came with Corda. His name is Colonel Aldrin, for the record. Briggs attempted to invoke command authority and was informed clearly that his command authority at Caldwell was suspended." Harriet's voice was neutral, but something behind it wasn't. "He left. He called his personal attorney from the parking lot." "And Slate?" "In the building," Harriet said. "3rd floor. He asked that you come up when you arrived." The 3rd floor of the administrative building had been entirely cleared of standard personnel. The offices that lined the corridor were occupied by people Mara didn't recognize. Federal investigators, military legal officers. A woman in civilian clothes who was speaking very quickly into a phone in a language Mara couldn't place from a distance. Every door she passed was either open with activity inside it or closed with a keycard override that had replaced the standard access panel. General Warren Slate was in what had been the facility commander's office. Not Briggs's office, the one above it, belonging to a man named Colonel Garrison Price, who was the base commander and who was, Harriet had mentioned without elaboration, also under review. Slate had not changed much in 4 years. He was in his early 60s, lean in the way of people who had spent decades in environments that didn't permit softness, with gray at his temples, and the kind of eyes that had processed a great deal and released very little of it. He was in uniform. He was standing at the window when Mara came in, looking out at the parking lot below, and he turned when he heard her. "Lieutenant," he said, "I'm a civilian nurse, sir." "You're a lot of things," he said, and there was something in it that was not quite warmth, but was in the same neighborhood. "Sit down." She sat. He stayed at the window for a moment longer, then came and sat across from her with the directness of someone who had decided not to spend time on preamble. "Here's where we are," he said. "The IG's investigation is moving from preliminary to active. That means subpoena authority, compelled testimony, formal document seizure. We've already locked the records under preservation order, and we're moving this morning to recover everything in Subseries C. Those are your incomplete complaint files. 7 files, she said. He looked at her. You knew about those. I knew about the pattern. I didn't have the files themselves until this week. There are 7, he said. And as of this morning, we believe there may be more that were moved to off-site storage rather than being filed at all. We're working on access to those. He paused. The 7 we have represent women who filed formal complaints against Briggs between 2017 and 2023. Most of them have not been in contact with investigators because they were never informed that their complaints were received. The system took their intake records and produced case numbers, and then it produced nothing else. Mara said nothing because there was nothing to say that would add to that. We're locating them, Slate said. That's a separate process from the Briggs prosecution, but it's happening simultaneously. He looked at her steadily. Your account, and specifically your record, the parts we've entered into the federal proceeding, reframes this case significantly. You're not the first person to report Briggs, but you're the first person to report him who couldn't be repositioned as a disgruntled subordinate. Because of the classification, because of what the classification represents, because of what the record says you're capable of, and what it says you've done. He leaned forward slightly. The memo he circulated, the retroactive conduct notation in your file, those look different when the jury knows who you are. There may not be a jury. There will be, Slate said. We're building a criminal referral. The assault, the fraudulent documentation, the systematic obstruction of protected complaints, that's not an administrative matter. That goes to prosecution. He paused. The question right now is what Price knew. The facility commander. Whether he was aware of the complaint suppression and chose to ignore it, or whether he was actively involved in it. What do you think? Slate's expression shifted by something so small it was barely measurable. I think people don't survive in positions like his without knowing which systems they're benefiting from. But thinking and proving are different things, and right now we're in the proving stage. He stood. I need you to give a full formal statement this morning. Corte will conduct it. It'll be recorded and entered into the federal record. I've already given a preliminary statement. This one is under oath, he said, and this one will cover the classified portions of your record as they relate to your assessment of the incident. We need the full picture, not the version that fits a standard civilian conduct complaint. Mara stood as well. All right. Slate looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of someone who had something else to say and was choosing whether to say it. He said it. You handled this correctly from the beginning, every decision from the first day to last night. I know you don't need me to tell you that. It's still useful to hear, she said. He almost smiled. Get to Corte. She's on the second floor. The formal statement took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Corte conducted it with Rourke beside her and a third person Mara hadn't seen before, a legal officer named Major Thornton, who was there specifically to manage the classified portions, and who asked precise questions in a way that made clear he had read Mara's service record thoroughly and understood what he was looking at. Mara answered everything. Not efficiently. Accuracy took longer than efficiency. She described the orientation hall with the precision of someone whose sensory memory was not selective. The arrangement of the chairs, the distance between herself and Briggs when the strike occurred, the exact words in their exact order, the responses of the people around her. She described her interactions with Briggs over the previous 11 months with the same precision. She described what she had done and why in the hours following her suspension, the decisions she'd made, the calls she'd taken. When Thornton began asking about the classified portions of her record, she answered those too, in the clinical, detached way that military people discussed classified things in formal proceedings. Not without weight, but without embellishment. She'd spent 9 years in environments that required a specific kind of adaptability, a particular set of skills that had nothing to do with nursing and everything to do with assessing threat rapidly and responding to it proportionally. What Briggs had interpreted as passivity in that orientation hall, her stillness, her controlled response, was the exact opposite of passivity. It was restraint applied with precision, the kind that came from knowing exactly what you were capable of and choosing not to use it. Thornton asked her directly, when Commander Briggs struck you, did you perceive it as a physical threat requiring defensive response? I perceived it as an act of deliberate public humiliation intended to establish dominance and signal to the room that complaints against him had no institutional backing. I assessed the risk of physical escalation as low. I assessed the strategic value of restraint as high. Thornton looked at her for a moment. You made that assessment in real time. Yes. He wrote something. Thank you, Ms. Voss. While Mara was in the statement room, the second and third floors of Caldwell's administrative building were running on parallel tracks that occasionally intersected in the lobby with the particular friction of multiple federal teams operating in the same space with overlapping jurisdictions and different clocks. Corda's team was pulling records. Thornton's team was reviewing personnel files. A third group, which answered to an attorney from the Department of Justice that nobody except Slate had met before this morning, was constructing the criminal referral package that would determine what charges were brought, when, and against whom. In the records department, Petra Hollis had come in for her regular shift and found the department occupied by two federal investigators who had questions about Subseries C and about the access log that showed her activity from 2 days prior. She had answered their questions in the same way she had decided to photograph the files, directly, without hedging, with the acceptance of someone who has moved past the point of protecting herself and is now only interested in accuracy. They asked if she had removed any documents. No, she said. I photographed them and forwarded the images. The files themselves are where they were. They asked her why. She thought about that for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to give the honest one, not the version that sounded better. Because I'd been looking at those case numbers for 2 years, she said, and I knew what they were and what they weren't. And I'd been doing the reasonable thing for 7 years, and I decided to stop. The investigator wrote something. We'll need a formal statement. I figured, she said. At noon, something happened that nobody in the federal team had anticipated, and that changed the temperature of the investigation in a way that would reverberate through the rest of the day. A woman walked into the Caldwell lobby and asked to speak with whoever was in charge. Her name was Captain Denise Falconer, retired. She was 41 years old, and she had served at Caldwell for 3 years before being transferred to a facility in Tennessee in 2019, the year after she had filed a formal complaint against Commander Roland Briggs. She had driven 4 hours from her home in Charlottesville that morning after seeing a news alert, the first public mention of the investigation. A 2-line item from a regional outlet that had gotten hold of enough information to run something brief and factual before Caldwell's public affairs office could respond with a prepared statement. She had not been contacted by investigators. Her complaint had been assigned a case number and then had never produced another document. She had driven 4 hours and walked in off the street. The investigator who took her initial statement later told Corta that Falconer had the specific composure of someone who had rehearsed this conversation many times over many years and had not been certain she would ever actually get to have it. She was precise about dates, specific about incidents, and completely without theatrics. She stated what had happened to her in the same tone she might have used to file a supply report. By 2 in the afternoon, 2 more women had called the IG's office tip line. By 4, there were 4 calls. Corta sat in the facility commander's office, which was functionally the command center for the federal operation now, and looked at the growing list on her laptop screen. Her face was doing the thing it did when the shape of a case became larger than the case she'd started with. Rourke, she said, I see it. The scope of this investigation just changed. I know. Get Thornton and the DOJ attorney in here. I need to talk to Slate. Slate heard the update standing at the window again. He had a habit of windows, Mara had noticed. The specific posture of someone who thought better when they could see some distance. How many total? He said. 7 in the files here, Corta said. 4 incoming calls today. Falconer in the lobby. That's 12 confirmed. We don't have a ceiling yet. Slate was quiet for a moment. Price, he said. Not a question. His command period overlaps with 6 of the 7 filed complaints. He was present at the facility during every case that was suppressed. The records preservation notice went out under his name in 2019 as part of a routine administrative review, which means he reviewed the records that year and had the opportunity to see those open case files. Did he? We don't know yet. We're pulling his access logs from the records management system. If he accessed Subseries C during that review, the log will show it. She paused. We also found a transfer authorization in 2021 that moved 2 personnel files to off-site storage in a way that bypassed standard archival protocol. Price's signature. Slate turned from the window. What was in those files? We're working on access now. The off-site facility is in Fredericksburg. Our team is there today. Make sure I have that before end of day, he said. Then, to Mara, who had been sitting in the corner of the room for this conversation because nobody had asked her to leave. "How are you doing?" It wasn't a question exactly. It was a check. "I'm fine," she said, which was partly true. She was functional, which was what fine actually meant in this context. "We're going to need you available this afternoon," he said. "Briggs's attorney has made contact. He's pushing for a pre-arraignment meeting, and he's going to argue that the assault was a reactive disciplinary gesture that was disproportionate but not criminal. We need your statement on the record before he has a chance to establish that framing." "It's already on the record." "He's going to argue the classified portions of your background make you a biased witness, that your training gives you a specific interpretive lens that distorts your reading of the incident." Mara thought about that. It was actually a reasonable legal argument in the narrow sense. Not correct, but reasonable. The kind of thing an attorney could build something on if the record wasn't locked down carefully. "He's going to argue that I provoked it." "Yes. He'll need a witness to support that." "He's working on that too," Corta said. "There's a staff member, administrative level, not clinical, who has indicated willingness to provide a statement supporting Briggs's version of events. We don't know who yet. We're working on identifying them." The room was quiet for a moment. Mara thought about the 43 people in the orientation hall. 43 people who had not spoken. Most of them, she believed, because they were afraid, but most was not all. "It'll be someone who's been protected by him," she said. "Not someone who likes him. Someone who owes him something." Corta looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "Because nobody likes Roland Briggs. They're afraid of him or they're indebted to him. The afraid ones don't help him. Afraid people are too practical. It's the indebted ones." Corta turned to Rourke. "Cross-reference Briggs's performance review records with any staff who received favorable reclassifications or grade upgrades in the past 5 years." Rourke was already typing. Mara spent the early afternoon in a secondary conference room reviewing documents that Thornton's team had flagged as relevant to her formal statement. Not classified materials, but the administrative paper trail from the past 11 months at Caldwell. Things she'd been peripherally aware of, and that now had a different weight when read as part of a connected pattern. She read the memo Briggs had circulated after the incident. Reading it was a different experience than hearing about it. It was constructed carefully, in the language of institutional concern, with specific references to documented events that had been described in ways that were technically adjacent to reality, but functionally false. It was the work of someone who had done this before and knew how to use bureaucratic language as camouflage. It made her tired in a way that anger didn't. She was still reading when Major Thornton knocked and came in. "We need you in the lobby," he said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not urgency exactly, but something compressed and focused. "Now, if possible." She followed him out. In the lobby, 3 things were happening simultaneously. Colonel Aldrin was speaking quietly but intensely, with a man in a business suit who had an attorney's specific posture. The posture of someone who has been told to establish a position and is doing so under pressure. This was, she understood, Briggs's attorney. He had come to the facility personally, which was either a tactic or a miscalculation, or both. Near the main entrance, 2 new people had arrived. A man and a woman in civilian clothes with federal credentials who were not part of Corta's team. They had a different energy, the kind that came from a different department with a different chain of command. And standing at the reception desk, in the specific stance of someone who has traveled a long way and is not interested in being told to wait, was a woman in her mid-30s in civilian clothes with a military bearing that civilian clothes could not fully cover. She had her identification out on the counter, and she was speaking to the duty officer with the focused calm of someone who knows exactly what they need and has stopped asking politely for it. Mara recognized the bearing before she recognized anything else. She'd been in enough rooms with enough people to know how a person carried 9 years of operational service in their posture, in the set of their shoulders, in the specific economy of their eye contact. The woman looked up and found Mara across the lobby. "Voss?" she said. Mara crossed the lobby. The woman's name was Sergeant Major Lena Roth, retired, and Mara knew her in the way that people know each other when they've shared a specific type of experience that very few people have. Not closely, not with the warmth of long friendship, but with the bedrock recognition of shared context. They had been in the same operational unit for 14 months before Mara's transfer. They had not spoken since. "You drove in," Mara said. "Flew," Roth said. Denver. She looked around the lobby. The federal teams, the document boxes, the attorney in the corner. This got big. Yes. I saw the regional piece this morning, 2 lines. She looked back at Mara. I filed a complaint in 2020. Not here. A different facility. Against a different officer. She paused. But when you're networked in certain ways, you hear things. And I heard Briggs's name in 2021 in a context I didn't fully understand at the time. She set her credentials back on the counter. I understand it now. You have information, Mara said. I have a name, Roth said. An officer who transferred out of Caldwell in 2021, who told me something informally that I didn't know what to do with at the time because I didn't have enough context. She looked at Mara steadily. She told me she'd filed something here and that someone above her, not Briggs, above Briggs, had personally told her to withdraw it. Above Briggs. Price, Mara said. I don't know his name, but I know hers, and I know where she is, and she's the reason I'm standing here. Roth glanced at the desk officer. I need to talk to whoever's running this. Come with me, Mara said. She walked Roth toward the elevator and was 3 steps from it when Corta appeared from the stairwell door beside it, moving fast with Rourke behind her and an expression that had left professional neutrality behind somewhere on the 2nd floor. She stopped when she saw Roth. Tell me, she said. Roth told her concisely, the same thing she'd told Mara. Corta listened without interrupting. When Roth finished, Corta looked at Rourke and said, Get Thornton, get the DOJ attorney, get them in the conference room in 4 minutes. Rourke turned and went back through the stairwell door. Corta looked at Mara and Roth with the expression of someone who has been building a structure for 14 months and has just found the keystone. This takes us past Briggs, she said. I know, Mara said. If what you're describing is accurate, she was looking at Roth now, then we're not looking at a single officer who covered for himself. We're looking at a facility commander who used his authority to personally suppress protected complaints. That's a different set of charges. That's a different level of federal exposure. Roth nodded. Then I came to the right place. The elevator opened. They got in. The lobby below them continued its organized motion. Documents moving, teams working, a lawyer in a corner making a call that was about to become significantly less useful than he hoped it would be. Outside, the military police vehicles sat at the entrance, and the morning had pushed into afternoon, and the facility around them was running its clinical operations while its administrative structure was being dismantled floor by floor. Somewhere in the building, on the 3rd floor, in an office he was no longer authorized to occupy, the desk that had belonged to Colonel Garrison Price still had his nameplate on it. That would change. The DOJ attorney was named Serena Park, and when Roth finished her account in the conference room, dates, names, the conversation she'd had with the transferring officer in a coffee shop in Fredericksburg in the fall of 2021, Park sat with her hands flat on the table and said nothing for a full 6 seconds. Then, I need that officer's contact information. Roth produced a piece of paper with a phone number and an address. Park looked at it. Then she looked at Corta. We need to move on Price's off-site files today. Tonight, if possible. The team is in Fredericksburg now, Corta said. Tell them to prioritize anything with Price's authorization signature and any complaint-related materials from 2019 to 2022. Corta was already on her phone. Park looked at the piece of paper for another moment. Then she looked at Roth and Mara with the expression of someone who has watched a case she thought she understood become something else entirely. One man hitting a nurse, she said, mostly to herself. And we're looking at a decade of institutional cover-up with command-level authorization. That's how these things usually work, Mara said. Park looked at her. You knew it would get this far? Mara thought about the 7 files, about Falconer driving 4 hours and walking in off the street, about Roth flying in from Denver with a name on a piece of paper, about the women who had trusted a system that had taken their words and made them disappear. I knew what was there, she said. I didn't know how much of it we'd be able to reach. The phone on the table buzzed. Corta's, not Park's. Corta picked it up and listened, and the quality of her listening changed about 15 seconds in. She set the phone down. The Fredericksburg team found the off-site files, she said. They're faxing the inventory now. The fax machine in the corner of the room began to print. Nobody moved to get it immediately. There was a moment, brief, almost involuntary, where every person in the room held the specific stillness of people who know they're about to read something that will make the thing they were already doing bigger and harder and more important. Then Park stood and walked to the fax machine and pulled the first page and read it. Her face was a controlled thing. She had made a career of controlled faces. But something shifted in it, not dramatically, just enough to be readable to people who were watching for it. She handed the page to Corta without a word. Cort read it, handed it to Mara. The inventory listed 41 personnel files. 41, not 7. 41 files that had been transferred to off-site storage under Price's authorization, bypassing standard archival protocol between 2018 and 2022. At the bottom of the first page, in the inventory notes, a single line from the Fredericksburg team. Files contain complaint intake records, case-numbered documents, and in several cases, letters of personal withdrawal of complaints signed by claimants. Authenticity of signatures pending verification. Mara read that last line twice. Signed withdrawal letters. Letters that would have been used to close the case files officially, to produce not just incomplete records, but formally closed ones. Letters that, if the signatures were coerced or forged, represented an additional level of obstruction that went beyond suppression into active falsification. She set the page down on the table. The signatures need to be verified tonight, she said. Agreed, Park said. If any of them are forged. I know what it means, Park said, and her voice had the quality of someone who has just had the ceiling of a case they were already taking seriously lifted by several floors. Rourke. She turned to the doorway. Get forensic document examination on the line in the next 30 minutes. I don't care what time it is on the West Coast. Rourke stepped out. Park turned back to the table and stood with her hands flat on it again, looking at the inventory page, doing the math that prosecutors did when cases crossed from the manageable to the enormous. 41 files. Mara thought about the weight of 41 case numbers. 41 women who had made a decision, the specific and costly decision of saying something out loud to a system that was supposed to protect them. 41 decisions that a man had decided were obstacles to be managed rather than facts to be reckoned with. She thought about Price's office on the 3rd floor and his nameplate on the desk, and the way authority looked when you were inside it, solid, permanent, unchallengeable, and how quickly it could become a thing that had simply been there, briefly, in a room that was now being used for something else. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. The text was from a number she didn't recognize, 7 words. They know about the withdrawal letters. Tell no one. Mara stared at the message for 3 full seconds. Then she turned the phone toward Corta. Corta read it, and her expression sharpened into something that was past professional and into personal. She took the phone, photographed the screen, and handed it back. Someone in this building, she said quietly. Or someone with access to someone in this building, Mara said. Either way. Corta looked at Rourke's empty chair, at the door, at the window. We have a leak. The fax machine was still printing. The fax machine finished printing. Nobody moved to collect the remaining pages for a moment. Corta was still looking at the text on Mara's phone screen, and the room had the quality of a space where the air had changed. Not dramatically, not with any sound or visible signal, but in the way that rooms changed when everyone in them understood simultaneously that the problem was larger than the walls. How many people know about the withdrawal letters? Mara asked. Corta thought about it with the efficiency of someone inventorying a room. In this building right now. Me, Rourke, Thornton, Park, Slate, the Fredericksburg team, Roth. She looked at the door. Rourke stepped out 4 minutes ago. Who did Rourke speak to after he left this room? Corta moved to the door before Mara finished the sentence. She opened it, scanned the corridor, and came back in 30 seconds. He's at the end of the hall on the phone. I can't tell who he's calling. Can you pull his call log? Not without a warrant, and he knows that. Corta's jaw was tight. He's been on my team for 2 years. That doesn't mean anything, Mara said, and she said it without cruelty, because it was simply true. People made calculations. They did it based on what they knew and what they owed and what they were afraid of, and 2 years of good work didn't immunize anyone against the specific pressure that came with being inside a federal investigation that was accelerating past its original scope. Park had been listening. We don't assume, she said. We verify. Corta, Pull the metadata on that text. Origin number, carrier, tower ping, if you can get it in the next 30 minutes. She looked at Mara. In the meantime, we treat this as a containment issue. Nothing new goes to the full team until we know where it came from. The Fredericksburg team still needs to move on those files, Mara said. They're already there. I'll contact them directly. Park pulled out her own phone and walked to the corner of the room. Her voice dropped to a professional murmur. Mara looked at the inventory page still on the table. 41 files. The number sat in her chest with a weight that was not personal, or not only personal. It was the weight of arithmetic. 41 decisions that had been made by someone to take women's accounts and physically relocate them to a building in Fredericksburg where they would produce nothing and be found by no one. Roth was watching her from across the table. You all right? Working on it, Mara said. That's usually the honest answer. Roth folded her arms. What do you need me to do? Tell Corda everything you know about the officer who contacted you in 2021. Not just what she said, how she said it, what her affect was, whether she seemed coerced or resolved. Roth nodded. She was resolved, she said. That was what got to me. She wasn't upset when she told me. She was past upset. She was in the place you get to when you've processed the anger and what's left is just the fact. Mara understood that place. She'd been there herself, more than once, in context she was not going to describe in this room. That'll matter for her statement, she said. Coerced withdrawals from people who are already past anger read differently than ones from people who are still afraid. It tells you something about the timeline and the method. Court had come back in. She'd heard the last part. It tells you whether they withdrew because they were threatened or because they were made to believe nothing would come of it regardless. Both are coercion, Roth said. Yes, Court said. But one requires documented threats and one requires documented systemic indifference. Both are criminal. The evidentiary path is different. She sat down and opened her laptop. The text came from a prepaid number, purchased yesterday. Cash, most likely. We won't have a purchase record. Purchased yesterday, Mara said, after the federal team arrived. Yes. Which means whoever sent it knew the investigation was here before the public notice went out. That's internal access. Or someone talking to someone internal, Park said, returning from her corner. The Fredericksburg team is securing the files now. Document examination team is on the line in 20 minutes. She looked at Corta. Who has administrative access to the facility's internal communication system right now? Standard access. All department heads, command-level staff, the duty officers. Corta's hands were on her keyboard. But administrative access was supposed to be restricted when we put the hold on the system this morning. Supposed to be, Park said. I'm checking the access log now. The room was quiet for 40 seconds while Corta worked. There's an access event at 1347, she said, after the hold. Someone used a command-level credential to access the internal communications system. Whose credential? Corta looked at the screen. Her expression did the thing expressions did when they confirmed something the person suspected and didn't want confirmed. Price, she said. Colonel Garrison Price. His credential was used to access the system at 1347. He's been removed from the building, Mara said. His credential hasn't been deactivated, Corta said, and the way she said it made clear whose administrative failure that was, and that she was already moving to address it. Someone had his login, or someone was using his physical access card if he left it in the building when he was removed last night. Park looked at Thornton, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table for the past 10 minutes. Major, I need a full inventory of what Price took with him when he left last night. Thornton stood. I'll find out who processed his removal. He left. Park turned back to the room with the expression of someone who has been doing this long enough to know that the complications inside an investigation were frequently more illuminating than the original case. Someone is watching this building from inside or through someone inside, she said. They knew about the withdrawal letters within minutes of us finding out. They sent a text to the one person in this room who is not a federal employee and therefore, theoretically, doesn't have the institutional loyalty pressures that would make the warning pointless. Everyone processed that. They wanted me to know, Mara said. Or they wanted to create chaos, Park said. Warning you doesn't accomplish anything functionally since you're not the one running the investigation. But it does create the appearance that the investigation has a leak, which creates doubt about the integrity of the evidence chain, which is useful to a defense attorney. Briggs's attorney was in the lobby this morning, Mara said. Park looked at her for one moment. Yes, she said. He was. The next hour moved with the specific compressed quality of situations where multiple things were developing simultaneously, and the people managing them had to triage their attention in real time. Court's team deactivated Price's credentials and conducted an inventory of the building's keycard access records for the past 18 hours. They found 2 badge scans that should not have been there. Price's card, used at the building's east entrance at 1412, an hour and a half after his administrative removal the previous evening. He had come back. Not through the main entrance where the military police were stationed, but through the east entrance, which operated on a secondary access system, the same east entrance Mara had used 2 nights ago. He was in the building for an unknown period this morning, Corta told Slate over the phone. We don't have camera coverage on the east corridor. He could have accessed his office, the records department, or the communications terminal. Slate's response was brief. Find him. He was not difficult to find. He was at his attorney's office in downtown Harwick, a fact they confirmed through a single call to the attorney's receptionist by a federal agent who identified herself as calling about a scheduling matter and was told that Colonel Price was currently in conference. It was a thin confirmation, but it was enough. Corta coordinated with local federal authorities. By 3 in the afternoon, 2 agents were at the attorney's office. What happened next was one of those moments that investigations produced occasionally. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a cinematic reveal, but a small, unglamorous capitulation that nonetheless carried the weight of everything it represented. Price had not known about the withdrawal letter inventory. He had accessed the communications system to send a single message through a command channel relay that he'd thought was still active. It wasn't. The hold had caught it. And when the agents arrived, he was in the process of telling his attorney about it, which meant the attorney already knew, which meant the attorney's advice was going to be to cooperate fully before the federal charge list got longer. It took 40 minutes. By 4:15, Garrison Price had agreed to a proffer session, preliminary cooperation in exchange for a conversation about what his cooperation might be worth to the government's case. It was not a deal. It was not immunity. It was a man who had spent 23 years protecting himself inside institutional structures, looking at the wreckage of those structures and doing the math. Slate was informed. He stood at the window in his appropriated office and said nothing for 11 seconds. He's going to give us Briggs, Corta said. He's going to give us everything that protects him, Slate said, which may include Briggs and may include things we haven't found yet. He turned from the window. Don't let Park give him anything before we know the full scope of what he has. She knows that. Make sure she knows I know she knows it. He looked at Corta directly. I've been watching Caldwell for 8 months. Since a report came across my desk that was supposed to be a routine flag and turned out to be the 5th time I'd seen a version of the same pattern from this facility. I need everything he has before anyone starts negotiating. Understood. And find the officer who told Roth about the withdrawal in 2021, before Price's attorney does. Mara was in the second-floor conference room when Roth brought her coffee. Not hospital coffee, actual coffee, from a place 2 blocks away that Roth had apparently located and visited while the rest of the building ran its operations. You don't need to... Mara started. I know, Roth said, and set it down. She sat across from her with her own cup and the expression of someone who had been carrying something for a while and had decided that the right environment to set it down in was this one. I should have called you 2 years ago, when that officer told me what happened with her complaint. You didn't have enough to do anything with. I had enough to make a call. I chose not to make it. She wrapped her hands around her cup. I told myself it wasn't my jurisdiction, it wasn't my facility, it was outside my lane. All of which was technically true and entirely beside the point. You came now, Mara said. Because you were visible, Roth said, and there was something in it that wasn't comfortable. I came because this time it was on a news alert, and I could walk into a building full of federal agents instead of making a cold call that might go nowhere. She looked at her coffee. That's not the same as courage. Mara thought about that. It's what courage looks like most of the time, she said. People don't move until they think the move will land somewhere. The trick is finding the thing that makes movement possible. That's a generous interpretation. It's an accurate one. She picked up her own cup. If you'd called me 2 years ago with a secondhand account from an officer who'd informally told you something over coffee, I couldn't have done anything with it either. The case needed 41 files and a federal team and a records coordinator who photographed things on her personal phone before any of it added up. Roth was quiet for a moment. Then, "What happens to you after this?" Mara considered the question honestly. "My suspension's been vacated. I can go back to the floor." She paused. "Whether I go back to the floor is a different question. You haven't decided. I've been in this building for 2 days and the rest of my life." She looked at the wall. "Ask me in a month." At 4:58, the forensic document examination team called Park with their preliminary results on the withdrawal letters. Park was in the facility commander's office with Slate when the call came in. She listened for 3 minutes, asked 2 questions, and hung up. She looked at Slate. 14 of the 41 withdrawal letters show signature inconsistencies consistent with either coercion, meaning they were signed under duress by the actual complainants, or fabrication. Formal analysis will take 48 hours for confirmation, but the preliminary finding is that at minimum 6 of the 14 are not authentic. Slate said nothing. 6 women's names signed to documents they never signed, Park said. Documents that were used to formally close their cases. The silence in the room was not empty. It was the silence of people who had believed they were building a case against a man who hit someone in a training room and had ended up standing at the edge of something that had been constructed over years with deliberate intention by people who understood exactly what they were doing. "Forgery," Slate said finally. "Federal obstruction. Deprivation of rights under color of law." "At minimum," Park said. "How does Price's proffer change?" "It gets considerably more valuable," she said. "If he can tell us who signed or ordered those documents, the chain of culpability goes beyond him and Briggs. We're looking at anyone who reviewed and approved those closures." She paused. The closures would have required a reviewing officer, each one. Someone signed off on case closure for 6 formally opened federal complaints. Who signed the closure authorizations? Park opened her folder. For 3 of the 6 suspected forgeries, Colonel Garrison Price. The quality of the silence changed again. "He didn't just suppress the complaints," Slate said. "No," Park said. "He officially closed them using documents he may have fabricated or ordered fabricated. He created a paper trail that made it look like women withdrew their complaints voluntarily." She put the folder down. "If the forensic confirmation holds, that is not a man who looked the other way. That is a man who built a machine." Mara heard the summary from Corta at 5:30. Standing in the corridor outside the conference room with the quality of light changing through the windows as the afternoon moved toward evening. The way Corta told it was efficient and without editorializing, the way you reported findings that were large enough not to require embellishment. When she finished, Mara didn't say anything for a moment. 6 forged signatures, she said finally. Preliminary. 48 hours for confirmation. Price signed the closures. 3 of them. The others are still being attributed. There may be additional reviewing officers involved. Mara thought about what it took to forge a document. Not technically. Technically, it was not complicated. But the decision of it. The moment when a person in a position of institutional authority looks at a woman's name on a complaint form and decides that the most efficient solution is to produce a document that does not exist and attach her name to it. The specific calculation that said, "This is a problem I can make smaller by making it disappear, and the disappearing is worth the risk." That calculation had been made 6 times, provably. Maybe more. "The women whose signatures were forged," she said. "Do they know?" "Not yet. We're working on contact protocols. Victims' rights requirements govern how we notify them, and we need to be careful about the sequence." Corta's voice was even, but she looked tired in the way that came from sustained concentration over too many hours. "They submitted their complaints years ago. Some of them will have moved on. Some of them will have been carrying this. They should know before anything is public." "I know." Corta looked at her. "That's the plan. It's not a quick process." Mara nodded. "How's Ashworth?" The question shifted Corta's expression slightly. The specific shift of someone being pulled back from one register into another. "He was moved from recovery to a regular room this afternoon. Vitals stable. Expected full recovery." "Good." She meant it cleanly, without performance. Denny Ashworth was 26 years old and had been 2 to 4 hours from a different outcome. That was the part of the past 2 days that was most straightforward. A person had been in danger and was now going to be okay. And that had happened because Yolanda had called, and because Mara had driven over, and because a surgical resident named Priya had put it in her handoff notes. A clean line of cause and effect. The rest of it was less clean. It was going to be less clean for a long time. At 6:20, Roland Briggs arrived at the Caldwell Administrative Building with his attorney and 2 of his own witnesses, both current staff members, both in civilian clothes, with the stiff posture of people who had agreed to something and were beginning to have private doubts about it. The attorney's name was Gregor Falk. He was a man in his late 50s who had spent his career defending people in positions of institutional authority and who had the specific confidence of someone accustomed to arriving at facilities like this one and renegotiating the terms of the conversation. He had scheduled this meeting through a formal channel as a pre-proceeding statement opportunity, which was a mechanism that existed in which the federal team was obligated to accommodate. Falk and his clients were placed in a ground-floor meeting room by Agent Rourke, who had been cleared, the call log showing he'd been speaking with his mother, a fact that had made Corta briefly close her eyes, and informed that Special Agent Corta and DOJ Attorney Park would be with them shortly. What happened instead was that Major Thornton came in first, alone, and sat down across from Falk without preamble. "Before we begin," Thornton said, "I want to make you aware of some developments in the investigation since your scheduling request this morning." Falk smiled the professional smile. "Of course." Thornton laid 3 documents on the table. Each one was a summary, not the full file, just the summary, printed on plain paper, because the full files were still in the chain of custody process and would not be shared in this room tonight. The first summary covered the 41 files recovered from Fredericksburg. The second covered the forensic preliminary on the withdrawal letters. The third was a single paragraph about Price's proffer agreement. Falk read each one. His expression managed itself, which was what trained expressions did, but there was a calibration happening behind it that Mara, watching through the small window in the door alongside Corta, could see in the set of his jaw and the stillness that came over his hands when he reached the third document. "I'll need to confer with my client," he said. "Of course," Thornton said. "Take all the time you need." He came out of the room, and in the corridor he looked at Corta and said simply, he didn't know about the forged signatures. "Briggs didn't know," Corta said. "Falk didn't know." Thornton glanced back at the closed door, which means Briggs may not have known either, or it means he knew and didn't tell his attorney. If Price forged documents without Briggs's knowledge, the dynamic between them changes, Mara said. "It also potentially changes Briggs's motivation to cooperate," Court said, working through it. "If Price built a cover-up system that extended past what Briggs authorized, Briggs has something to gain from separating himself from it." "2 men pointing at each other," Mara said. "Which is often how you get the truth," Thornton said, without satisfaction. It wasn't a satisfying truth. It was a functional one. Falk came out of the meeting room 11 minutes later. He had the look of a man who had recalculated the field in front of him and found it significantly changed. "My client would like to make a voluntary statement," he said, "under the appropriate legal protections." Corta looked at him steadily. "Tell me what he knows about the withdrawal letters." Falk paused. "He knows who authorized them." The corridor was quiet. Somewhere in the building above them, papers were moving and laptops were open, and the machinery of accountability was doing the slow, unglamorous work it did. "Then we'll need that name," Corta said. Briggs's statement took 90 minutes. Mara was not in the room for it. She was in the second-floor conference room with Roth and Harriet Sue, who had returned to the building at 5 o'clock with a revised civil complaint that now referenced the federal obstruction findings and the forensic evidence, and that had expanded from a battery claim to a document that covered assault, wrongful suspension, fraudulent personnel notation, and civil rights violations under federal statutes. Harriet had spread the documents on the table with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this expansion and had prepared for it. She walked Mara through each section with the attention of a person who took the administrative detail of justice as seriously as its concept. "The suspension vacatur gives us the employment rights claim," she said. "The retroactive conduct notation gives us the fraudulent documentation claim. The assault is the anchor." She looked up. "Civil proceedings are separate from the criminal case. The criminal charges are the government's, These are yours. What's the realistic outcome? Mara asked. Harriet was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that wasn't hesitation, but precision. In a case with this evidentiary record, with a federal criminal proceeding running parallel, with victim witness testimony from multiple parties, the realistic outcome is significant. She paused. I don't speculate on dollar figures in preliminary stages. What I will say is that the institution, Caldwell, the command structure, has substantial exposure. Not just Briggs personally, the system that allowed this to continue. I want the women in those files to be able to participate, Mara said, in whatever form is available to them. Harriet looked at her. That will be their choice. I know. I want the mechanism to exist. It will, Harriet said. Once the federal case establishes the evidentiary foundation, civil claims from additional parties become significantly more viable. It creates a path. She capped her pen. Is that what you're thinking about right now? The other women? Mara considered how to answer that accurately. I'm thinking about what this is for, she said. I'm not angry at Briggs. I'm angry. It's in there, but it's not the driving thing. She looked at the table. The driving thing is the 7 files that Petra Hollis photographed, and the 41 files in a building in Fredericksburg, and the 6 signatures that weren't real. Those things happened inside a structure that was supposed to prevent them, and the structure didn't fail. It was used, deliberately. That's what I want addressed. That's what's being addressed, Harriet said. I know. Mara looked up. I just want to say it clearly. So when this is over and there's a settlement number and everyone moves on, the record reflects what the actual object of this was. Harriet held her gaze. I'll make sure it does. So, at 8:43 p.m., Corta came to find Mara. Her expression was the careful version. Not guarded, not alarmed, but managed in the way that things were managed when they were significant and the significance needed to be delivered without distortion. Briggs's statement identified a name, she said. The person who authorized the withdrawal letter system, not Price. Mara looked at her. Price implemented it, Corta said. Managed it, signed the closures, handled the off-site storage. But the original authorization, the decision to create a systematic method of handling complaints against Briggs, came from someone above Price's pay grade. Who? Court sat down. A brigadier general named Wallace Hearn, retired. He was the regional medical command director until 2022. His jurisdiction covered Caldwell and 7 other facilities. She paused. He retired with full honors. He's currently serving on the board of 3 military medical advocacy organizations. The room processed that. Briggs is sure, Mara said. Briggs has documentation. Hearn was careful. Most of the authorization was verbal. But there's one email, from 2018, drafted carefully enough to be deniable but specific enough to be read clearly in context. Does Slate know? I'm going to him now. Corta stood. I wanted you to hear it first. She paused. Because you are the reason we're in a room where Briggs is cooperating with federal investigators. If you'd responded differently in that orientation hall, if you'd been angry, if you'd escalated, if you'd given them anything to reframe, none of the rest of this would have the momentum it has. Mara looked at her. I responded the way I responded because of what I knew and what I'd been trained to do. I'm not going to pretend that was a moral calculation. Maybe not, Corta said, but it worked. She moved to the door. Go home tonight. Get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be long. After she left, Mara sat alone in the conference room for a while. The building around her was still running. There were lights on, footsteps above her, a phone ringing somewhere on the floor above. The investigation did not stop for evening. Cases at this level didn't have shift changes. She thought about Wallace Hearn and his board memberships and his full honors retirement. She thought about 2018 when the email had been sent. When someone in a position of regional authority had looked at a problem and decided that the most efficient solution was a system, not a single act of suppression, a system, with a method and an implementer and a storage facility in Fredericksburg. She thought about Denny Ashworth on the 2nd floor, recovering from surgery that had happened because she had come back to a building she was suspended from, because Yolanda had called her, because the clinical reality of a deteriorating patient did not negotiate with administrative holds. She thought about the women she would never meet who had written their names on complaint forms in good faith and whose names had later appeared on documents they had never seen. Her phone was on the table. She picked it up and looked at it. No new messages. The prepaid number that had texted her this afternoon had not sent anything else. It probably never would. It had served its purpose, whatever that purpose had turned out to be, and now it was a piece of evidence in a chain that led somewhere the people who had created it had not anticipated. She was about to put the phone down when it rang. A number she recognized, a Caldwell internal extension, the nursing floor. She answered. Mara? Yolanda's voice, late shift tired, the specific flavor of it. Ashworth is asking for you. He's been awake for 3 hours and he knows something happened. He's not stupid. He can hear the buildings different. He's asking for the nurse who came to his room last night. Mara stood. I'll be up in 5 minutes. You don't have to. 5 minutes, she said, and picked up her jacket. She took the stairs. The second floor was quieter than it had been yesterday. The clinical operations were running, but the administrative disruption had not reached the patient floor in any way that changed the work. Patients still needed vitals checked and pain managed and questions answered. The floor was indifferent to federal investigations in the way that it was indifferent to everything except the specific needs of the people in its rooms. Room 14 was dim. Ashworth was propped up slightly, the way post-op patients sat when they'd been told that flat was not good for them, but fully upright was still too much. He was pale in the way of blood loss recovery. Not sickly, just depleted, the body working on rebuilding what it had lost. He looked at her when she came in. You're the one, he said. I'm one of several, she said, pulling a chair to the bedside. The surgical team did the actual work. I know, Priya told me. He shifted slightly, winced, settled. She also said you called it the guarding thing, the referred pain. I had a read on your presentation. I passed it along. He looked at her for a moment with the directness that people had sometimes when they had been close to something serious and hadn't been able to avoid knowing it. She said it was another couple of hours, give or take. So, he was quiet for a moment. Thanks. Mara looked at him. 26 years old, a corporal, recovering in a bed in a building that was in the process of being turned inside out, for reasons he probably half understood from the sounds and the different faces in the halls. He'd come in for a routine surgery and ended up in the middle of something that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the institution he'd been admitted into. How are you feeling? She said. Like someone fixed a problem by going through my stomach to get to it. That's accurate. He almost smiled. Is it true what people are saying about the commander? She thought about how to answer that. There's a federal investigation, she said. That part is true. And you're part of it. I'm a witness. He nodded slowly, processing that, or maybe just tired. Recovery had its own rhythm, and it didn't accommodate extended conversation well. I heard you got suspended, he said. Reinstated, she said. Good. He said it simply, without editorializing. You should be here. She looked at the monitors above his bed. His numbers were where they needed to be. The repair was holding. The body was doing the stubborn, unglamorous work it did when given the chance. She was about to stand when his hand moved, not reaching for her, just a gesture, the kind that indicated he wasn't done. What she said, he said. Priya. When she was prepping me for surgery, she said, quote, your nurse called this exactly right. He looked at her. She didn't say a nurse, she said your nurse. Mara looked at him. I just thought that was worth saying, he said. She stood and pushed the chair back to its original position. Get some sleep. She left the room and stood in the corridor for a moment, hand flat against the wall, the sounds of the floor around her, the monitors, the soft footsteps of the night shift, the distant sound of a patient call light being answered. Her phone buzzed. A text from Harriet Sue. Developments tonight. Briggs's attorney contacted me at 9:12 p.m. They want to discuss terms. She read it twice. Then a second text from Harriet, 8 seconds after the first. There's something else. One of the 2 witnesses Briggs brought tonight, the staff member who is going to provide the counterstatement. He's asked to speak with federal investigators instead. Mara stared at the screen. The witness Briggs had brought to support his version of events had changed his mind. She did not know what had happened in that ground floor meeting room tonight, did not know what the man had heard or read or decided, did not know whether it was the forensic findings or the price proffer, or simply the accumulated weight of being in a building that was running out of versions of the story that served his original choice. She knew what it meant. She walked to the stairwell, and she was halfway down the second-floor stairs when Harriet's third text arrived. He says he was in the room for a previous incident, not the one in the orientation hall. Before. He has a date and a victim's name. Mara stopped on the stairs. She stood there in the stairwell with the fluorescent light above her and the sound of her own breathing and the specific sober weight of a case that had just opened another door onto another corridor. A previous incident, a name. 41 files, and one more. She stood in the stairwell for another 10 seconds. Not frozen, processing. There was a difference, and she had learned it the hard way in places where the cost of confusing the two was immediate and irreversible. A previous incident, a name. She texted Harriet back. "Where's he now?" The reply came in under a minute. "Ground floor meeting room. With Rourke. He asked for federal investigators, not Briggs's attorney. The attorney is aware and furious." Mara started moving down the stairs again. She did not run. Running in a hospital building at 9:40 p.m. attracted the wrong kind of attention, and she had spent enough of the past 3 days attracting attention she hadn't wanted. She moved fast and quietly and came through the stairwell door into the ground floor corridor at a pace that was one gear below urgent. Corta was already outside the meeting room. "You got Harriet's text," Corta said. "Yes. His name is Adrian Mercer, administrative coordinator, been at Caldwell 4 years. He was one of the 2 witnesses Briggs brought tonight, but he didn't come because he wanted to support Briggs." Corta glanced at the closed door. He came because he thought being in the room with Briggs's attorney would give him cover if he changed his mind. He was looking for a way out, and the forensic findings gave him one. What did he see? 2019, conference room on the second floor, after hours. He was working late and he heard something from the room and looked through the door window. Corta's voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. A staff sergeant. She was crying. Briggs was still in the room when Mercer looked. He didn't go in. He didn't report it. She paused. He's been carrying it for 4 years. Mara thought about 4 years of carrying something you had looked through a window at and chosen not to enter. The specific weight of that. The way it calcified inside people. Not as guilt exactly, which was active, but as something heavier and more passive, a stone they'd picked up and couldn't put down because putting it down required admitting they'd been holding it. Does he know her name? Staff Sergeant Carla Odom. She transferred out in 2020. Corta looked at her. We're running her location now. She may already know about the investigation. She may. We'll reach her tonight regardless. Corta stepped back from the door. I wanted you to know because you asked about the women in the files. Odom may not be in any of the 41 files from Fredericksburg. What happened to her may have never been formally documented at all. Mara absorbed that. The cases they couldn't count because they'd never entered the system. The ones that hadn't even produced an incomplete file. That were carried only in the memory of a woman who had stopped working at this facility and in the guilty weight of a man who had looked through a window and turned away. What does Mercer need from this? She asked. To tell someone, Corta said. That's what it usually is when someone holds something this long. They need to put it somewhere that can carry it. Mara nodded. Then let him. Proud. The night ran long. By 11, Carla Odom had been reached by phone at her home in Roanoke. She had listened to Agent Rourke's identification and the brief summary of why they were calling, and then she had been quiet for a moment that Rourke later described as the longest 7 seconds of the call. Then she had said, I've been waiting for someone to find this. Not bitterly, just as a fact the way Roth had described her officer, resolved, past the anger, in the place where only the fact remained. She would give a formal statement the following morning. She would drive to Harwick herself. She did not need to be asked twice. By midnight, Briggs's attorney had submitted a formal request for a cooperation agreement. The request was specific about what Briggs was offering, his full account of the command structure's management of complaints against him, including 2 conversations with Hearn that he had documented in personal notes dating from 2018 and 2020, and his confirmation of the withdrawal letter system and its authorization chain. In exchange, He was asking for consideration on the assault charge and the fraudulent documentation charge. Park reviewed the request with the expression of someone who had seen this kind of offer before and knew exactly what it was worth and what it wasn't. She did not respond that night. She let the request sit because letting it sit was a form of information. It told Briggs's attorney that the government did not need what Briggs was offering as badly as Briggs needed to offer it. At 1 a.m, Slate called a brief all hands in the facility commander's office. 12 people standing or sitting in a room that was not designed for 12 people, with laptops open and the particular weariness of a team that had been running on concentration and bad coffee since 7 a.m. He stood at the front of the room and said, without preamble, "Here's where we are. We have 41 files from Fredericksburg, of which forensic examination will confirm the forgery count in 48 hours. We have Price in a proffer session. We have Briggs seeking cooperation terms. We have a witness account of a potential additional victim who will give a statement in the morning. And we have documentation pointing to Brigadier General Wallace Hearn as the authorizing officer for the suppression system." The room was quiet. "Tomorrow morning we will be contacting Hearn's legal representatives," Slate said. "Simultaneously, we will be coordinating with the Senate subcommittee on the timing of their public notification and with Caldwell's Public Affairs Office on a statement that accurately reflects the scope of the federal investigation without compromising the criminal proceeding." He looked around the room. "The criminal referral goes to the DOJ by end of week. Park is managing that timeline." Park nodded from the corner. "The victim's notification protocol begins tomorrow afternoon," he said. "Every woman whose name appears in those files, every woman we can reach, they hear from us before anything is public. That is non-negotiable." He looked at each person in the room briefly, the specific eye contact of someone making sure a point has landed. Questions. There were practical ones: jurisdiction, timing, media coordination. They were answered efficiently. By 1:45, the room had dispersed. Slate caught Mara at the door. "Go home," he said. "You said that yesterday. And you didn't fully listen. I'm saying it again." He looked at her with the particular directness he had. Not unkind, but without padding. "Tomorrow is going to require you to be functional. The days after that are going to require it more. You've done everything you needed to do tonight." She looked at him. "Hearn," she said, "how sure are you? About the evidence?" "Very." "About the outcome?" He held the word for a moment. "Sure enough." He paused. "He's been protected by his retirement, his board positions, his reputation. None of that survives what we have on paper." "He built a system," Mara said. "That's what keeps going through my head. Not that he covered for someone he was protecting. He built a method, a procedure." "I know. That takes a specific kind of thinking. It takes someone who looks at a structural problem and designs a structural solution. Price couldn't have built it on his own. Price was the maintenance crew. Hearn was the architect." Slate said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's exactly right, and it's exactly what the criminal referral will argue." He looked at her. "You would have made a good prosecutor." "I'm a nurse," she said. "You're a lot of things," he said again, the same way he'd said it that morning, and this time she heard what was in it clearly. Not a compliment exactly, but an acknowledgement of the specific complexity of being a person who contained multiple true things simultaneously and had spent years managing the tension between them. She went home. What? She slept 6 hours and woke before the alarm. She made coffee and stood at the window in the early gray of the Harwick morning, watching the street below come to life with the specific gradualness of a city that was not dramatic about its mornings. A delivery truck. A woman walking a dog that was in no hurry. The streetlights going off in sequence as the sky decided it was finally light enough. She thought about the person she'd been 11 months ago when she'd first walked into Caldwell. The specific, deliberate smallness she'd constructed around herself. Not weakness, because she had never been weak, but a kind of chosen invisibility. The decision to be a nurse and only a nurse, to leave the other parts of what she was in a place that had no bearing on this floor. These patients, this life. She had wanted that. She had made that choice deliberately and had found something real in it. The work itself, which was not small, which was in fact the least small thing she had ever done. Keeping people alive. That was the whole of it. Everything else. Rank, history, classification, the weight of the things she'd done in places she couldn't name. None of it touched the specific satisfaction of a patient whose numbers held, of a call light answered, of a hand steadied in the particular fear of a hospital room at 3 in the morning. She had not needed Caldwell to know she was good at that. She had known it herself. But knowing something yourself and having the record show it were different things, and the record for a long time had shown nothing at all. A quiet woman on a trauma floor. A nurse who argued about deadlines and redirected condescension and kept her head down. A person Roland Briggs had looked at and seen something he believed he could use. He had been wrong about what she was. He had been catastrophically wrong. But the wrongness of his read had required 43 witnesses and a federal investigation and a records coordinator with a phone camera and a retired sergeant major flying in from Denver to become a fact that anyone else could see. She was tired of the things that were true about people only becoming visible when something large enough forced them into the light. She finished her coffee and got dressed and drove back to Caldwell. The morning was different from the previous two. The military police vehicles were still at the gate, but the cluster of confused staff members was gone, replaced by a smaller group near the entrance who had the look of people who had been briefed and were processing the briefing. Inside, the ground floor was calmer. The document boxes were stacked and labeled. The folding tables had consolidated from 4 to 2. The investigation was still running, but it had moved from emergency mode into the sustained operational mode that preceded formal proceedings. Carla Odom arrived at 9:15. Mara did not meet her formally. That was not her role, and Odom's statement was for federal investigators, not for witnesses. But she saw her in the lobby, a woman in her mid-30s with the specific kind of composure that came at a cost, dressed practically, carrying nothing except a small bag. She had driven 2 hours that morning. She walked in and gave her name to the duty officer and sat down to wait with the stillness of someone who had been waiting for much longer than the 20 minutes it would take for Rourke to come collect her. Mara did not approach her. What Odom was doing belonged to Odom, and the last thing she needed was the witness from the orientation hall treating her account as part of a larger narrative that Odom hadn't signed up for. What had happened to Carla Odom was its own thing, with its own weight, and the only respectful response to it was to let it be exactly that. She went upstairs. Yolanda Fitch found her at the nursing station at 9:40. Yolanda looked at her the way she'd been looking at her for 3 days, with the specific expression of someone who was keeping several feelings in neat compartments and occasionally letting one out at a time. HR sent a memo this morning, she said. About? Your reinstatement is formal now. Full restoration of benefits, back pay from the suspension date, official rescission of the conduct notation. She slid a printed copy across the desk. And the conduct board review has been closed with a finding of no basis. Mara looked at the document. The language was institutional and stripped of context, as all such documents were. The kind of language that processed consequential things through the narrow aperture of administrative form. But the content was exact. Everything Briggs had done in the administrative channel had been officially unmade. "How's Ashworth?" she said. "Up and walking the corridor this morning. He complained that the hospital food was worse than field rations, which the surgeon took as a good sign." Yolanda's expression shifted toward something warmer. "He asked about you again. I'll check on him after rounds." Yolanda looked at her for a moment. "Are you coming back? After all this settles?" Mara thought about what she'd told Roth the night before. "Ask me in a month." "I think so," she said. "I think this is where I want to be. Not because of what happened, that's not a reason to stay somewhere, but because the work is good and I'm good at it, and those two things don't overlap as often as people pretend they do." Yolanda nodded. "The 2 nurses who went to HR the morning after it happened," she said. "They both asked about you this week, separately. Neither of them knows I talked to the other one." Mara looked at her. "I thought you should know," Yolanda said. That you being visible in that room gave other people something to point to. It's not a small thing." "It's not a comfortable thing either," Mara said. "No," Yolanda agreed. "Comfort and importance are not the same category." She picked up a chart. "Go do your rounds." The formal press statement from Caldwell's Command Public Affairs Office went out at 2 in the afternoon. It was 3 paragraphs. It confirmed that a federal investigation was underway in cooperation with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, that personnel actions were in process, and that the facility remained fully operational. It named no names. It described no specifics. It was the kind of statement that communicated everything through what it didn't say. It was enough. By 4 p.m., the regional outlet that had run the first two-line item had a follow-up. By 5, 2 national outlets had picked it up. By 6, the story had found the specific kind of traction that stories found when they had enough documented specificity to be reported accurately and enough human stakes to be worth reporting at all. The elements were there: a federal investigation, a commander removed, records recovered from off-site storage, a nurse reinstated after wrongful suspension, a decade of suppressed complaints, and a retired brigadier general whose name had not yet been published, but whose legal representative had, by mid-afternoon, issued a statement that said his client was cooperating fully with investigators and had nothing to hide, which was the kind of statement issued specifically by people who had things to hide and were hoping cooperation would reduce the visibility of those things. It wouldn't. Wallace Hearn's legal representative had underestimated the scope of what Corta's team had built. They usually did. People who had spent careers inside institutions that protected them developed a specific kind of miscalibration about their own exposure. Not arrogance exactly, but a failure of imagination about what accountability actually looked like when the institution stopped protecting you. They had seen the institution absorb things before. They had watched complaints get filed and transferred and buried and forgotten. They had watched careers continue. They had operated inside a system that had demonstrated repeatedly that it could make things go away. The email from 2018 could not go away. It had been drafted carefully, careful enough that without context it was almost deniable, the language of administrative concern rather than explicit instruction. But Briggs' personal notes from 2018 and 2020 provided the context, and Price's proffer provided the corroboration, and the forensic evidence from the withdrawal letters provided the proof of what the instruction had produced. The DOJ criminal referral, submitted Thursday morning by Park, covered 5 federal charges against Hearn: conspiracy to deprive individuals of civil rights, obstruction of federal complaint procedures, abuse of official capacity, wire fraud for the false documentary record, and conspiracy to commit document falsification. The referral covered 7 charges against Price and 6 against Briggs, adjusted for what each had contributed to the system versus what each had operated within. The charges against Briggs included the assault. Simple, clean, factual. The thing that had started all of it, now embedded in a federal document that contextualized it within 11 years of institutional machinery that had been running since before Mara Voss had ever set foot in Harwick, Virginia. She heard about the referral from Harriet Sue, who called at 10 Thursday morning. 5 charges against Hearn, Harriet said, and there was something in her voice that was not celebration, but was adjacent to it in the way that people who had spent careers trying to move the unmovable felt something when it finally moved. 7 against Price, 6 against Briggs. Mara was on the 2nd floor, on break. She had come back to the floor that morning, not officially assigned, not yet, but present, because the work needed doing and she was there. The forgeries, she said. Confirmed. Forensic examination concluded Wednesday night. 8 of the 41 withdrawal letters are forgeries. 6 additional letters are classified as obtained under documented coercion. Women who withdrew their complaints after being told by reviewing officers that continuation of the complaint would result in negative personnel consequences. Harriet paused. That's 14 cases of direct obstruction, confirmed forensically or documentarily. The criminal referral covers all 14. And the women. Notifications were completed Wednesday evening. Every woman whose file was recovered, 41 contacts were attempted, 37 reached. All were informed of the investigation, all were provided with information about their legal options. 8 have already expressed interest in civil action. Harriet's voice was even, but careful, the way it was when she was handling something she knew mattered to Mara specifically. Carla Odom was contacted separately. She's being represented by a colleague of mine who specializes in cases of this type. Mara held the phone and looked at the wall across from her. The break room was empty, except for a half-full coffee pot and someone's forgotten lunch bag on the counter. Outside the window, the parking lot was ordinary and mid-morning and completely indifferent to the week that had just happened. 14, she said, confirmed. Likely more as the investigation continues. Hearn's been on the board of 3 advocacy organizations. He resigned from all 3 Wednesday afternoon, Harriet said, before the referral was filed. His attorneys advised it, and he complied. She paused. He's cooperating now. His attorney's language shifted from nothing to hide to committed to full transparency in about 18 hours, which tells you everything about what they found when they reviewed the actual evidence against him. What does cooperation get him? Potentially a reduced charge count, not an elimination. Harriet's voice was precise. The DOJ is not interested in giving Hearn a clean exit. He designed the system. The referral language is specific about that. He is described as the originating architect. Whatever cooperation he provides will be weighed against the scale of what he built. She paused. I want to be clear that the outcome of the criminal proceedings is not something I can predict or promise, but the direction of this is not ambiguous. Mara thought about direction. The direction of things had been clear to her from the moment Slate's colonel had walked into that corridor and told Briggs's staff member to go help his boss pack. What had changed in the days since was not the direction, but the scope. How wide and how deep the thing was, how many levels of institutional architecture had been deployed to maintain what one man had started, and what the institution above him had decided was worth protecting. The civil case, she said, I filed formally this morning. Against Briggs personally, against the command structure, and against the facility as an institutional entity. The federal criminal referral significantly strengthens the civil case on every count. Harriet allowed herself a brief pause. I also want to tell you that 3 of the 8 women interested in civil action have asked whether they can be represented by the same counsel. 2 of them specifically asked if you were involved. Mara sat with that for a moment. I'm not their representative, she said carefully. My case is mine. Their cases are theirs. I know. And I told them that, but there's a version of this down the road after the criminal proceedings have moved further, where a consolidated civil action makes strategic and financial sense for the plaintiffs, and where your willingness to have your case documented in detail creates a precedential foundation that benefits the others. She paused. I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I'm telling you the landscape. Okay, Mara said. I hear the landscape. Good. A pause. How are you doing? It was the second time in 3 days that someone had asked her that and genuinely meant it. Working on it, she said, the same thing she'd told Roth. It was still the truest answer available. But Roland Briggs was formally arraigned on Friday. Mara was not in the courthouse for it. She was on the 2nd floor of Caldwell, doing her job, which was not a political statement and was not an act of deliberate symbolism, but was simply the thing she was doing while the rest of it happened in the rooms it was supposed to happen in. She heard about it from Harriet at lunch. 6 charges. Not guilty plea, which was expected. Bail set, conditions included surrender of credentials and restricted travel. His attorney had managed the initial proceeding efficiently, which was what competent attorneys did in situations where their client was plainly exposed. You managed the choreography while the substantive negotiation happened in the background. Price was arraigned the same afternoon. 8 charges. His proffer had been valuable enough that the DOJ had adjusted 2 of his charges down in severity, which was not the same as leniency and which his attorney had correctly characterized to the media as the result of full cooperation. His attorney was also managing the choreography. Hearn's arraignment was scheduled for the following week, pending a final determination on the charge count. His legal team had spent the intervening days attempting to negotiate a cooperation framework that would reduce his exposure, and the DOJ had spent the same days making clear that the negotiation had a ceiling and that it was lower than Hearn's attorneys wanted it to be. The 3 arraignments were covered by the outlets that had picked up the story Thursday. By the weekend, the coverage had expanded to include historical context, not the specific cases, which were protected, but the pattern, the years, the scope, the kind of coverage that happened when a story had enough documented specificity to sustain reporting beyond a single news cycle. Caldwell Military Medical Center's name appeared in every story. Colonel Garrison Price's name appeared. Roland Briggs's name appeared. Wallace Hearn's name appeared with his former title and his former board memberships and the 3 paragraphs of professional honors that had preceded it and then 5 charges, and the specific and public juxtaposition of those two things. Two weeks after the arraignments, the Senate Armed Services Committee Subcommittee on Military Personnel released a preliminary report on complaint handling procedures at military medical facilities. It covered 7 facilities, of which Caldwell was one. It documented systemic failures in 4 of them. It recommended 19 specific procedural reforms and called for independent oversight of complaint processing at all military medical institutions. The subcommittee staffer named Rowan sent Mara a copy with a 2-line note. Your testimony contributed materially to this report. Thank you for your willingness to be on record. Mara read the report over 2 evenings. It was dense and institutional in the way that policy documents were, built for implementation rather than readability, concerned more with system architecture than with human cost. But it was real. It was going somewhere. The 19 recommendations were numbered and assigned to oversight bodies that would track their implementation and report back to the subcommittee in 6 months. She thought about Petra Hollis, who had photographed files on her personal phone and sent them to an email address she'd found through methods she declined to describe. She thought about what Petra had done that morning and what it had cost her. Not much, ultimately, because the institution had collapsed too quickly to retaliate effectively. But Petra hadn't known that when she pressed send. She had done it anyway. She thought about the 2 nurses who had walked into HR independently on the morning after, in a building where the command had already circulated a counter-narrative. She thought about Roth boarding a plane in Denver with a name on a piece of paper. She thought about Mercer, who had looked through a window in 2019 and turned away, and had carried that for 4 years, and had finally put it down in a ground-floor meeting room with a federal agent across from him. None of them had been heroic. None of them had moved without hesitation or calculation or fear. They had been imperfect people doing the specific difficult thing of choosing movement over stillness when stillness was safer and more comfortable, and when the system around them had been built precisely to make stillness the rational choice. That was the part she kept returning to. Not the investigation, not the charges, not the specific machinery of accountability that had finally, after 11 years, begun to run. But the smaller decisions, the ones that didn't appear in any federal record, the ones that had made everything else possible. 6 weeks after her suspension was vacated, Mara received a formal letter from the Department of Defense. It was signed by a deputy undersecretary whose name she recognized from coverage of the investigation. It notified her that the review board convened under the federal proceeding had concluded its assessment of her conduct during the incident of record, the subsequent suspension period, and the events of the nights in question on the Level 2 trauma floor. The board's finding was 3 sentences. Her conduct during the assault had been lawful, measured, and consistent with the highest standards of professional restraint. Her clinical intervention in the care of Corporal Denny Ashworth had been medically sound, appropriate to the circumstances, and directly contributory to his survival. The board commended her judgment in both instances without reservation, a commendation. On paper. In the federal record. She set the letter on her kitchen table and looked at it for a while. She did not feel vindicated exactly. Vindication implied that the validation had been necessary for the thing to be real, and the thing had always been real. She had always known what had happened in that room, always known what she had done and what it had cost and what it had been worth. The letter confirmed what she knew to people who had needed confirmation. That was a different thing, and it was useful, but it was not the same as the underlying truth it was describing. What she felt, sitting at her kitchen table with the letter in front of her, was closer to completion than vindication. The specific quiet click of a thing that had been held open for longer than it should have been finally closing. She put the letter in a folder and put the folder in a drawer. 3 months after the investigation, Slate called. She was in her car in the Caldwell parking lot, off a long shift, eating a sandwich she'd been meaning to eat for 4 hours. She almost didn't answer because she was tired and the sandwich deserved her full attention. She answered. "There's a project," he said without preamble. "Federal, 18 months, maybe 24. It involves a working group on complaint handling reform at military medical institutions. Not just policies, but the training for the people who process complaints, the structural changes that make suppression harder to execute and easier to detect." He paused. "They want someone who can speak to both the clinical environment and the systemic failures from a documented personal position. Someone who can work across both the institutional and the human dimensions of the problem. Another pause. I told them I knew someone. Mara finished chewing. That's a long time to be away from the floor. They'd want you on a consulting basis, he said, not full-time secondment. You could negotiate the terms. She looked through the windshield at the parking lot. The late afternoon light was doing the thing it did in October in Virginia, cutting low and amber across the pavement, catching the edges of everything and making the ordinary look briefly worth looking at. She thought about the 19 subcommittee recommendations sitting in a policy document waiting for implementation. She thought about the difference between a recommendation and a reality, between a document and a system, between a system on paper and a system that actually caught the things it was supposed to catch before they became what Caldwell had become. Who else is on the working group? She said. Park, a medical ethics board from Georgetown, 2 former IG investigators, a survivor advocate from a veterans' rights organization. He paused. They're not just designing policy, they're building training curriculum, the specific skills required to identify, document, and escalate complaints in ways that the system can't absorb and lose. His voice was even. It's the kind of work that takes a long time and produces results you mostly don't get to see. I know the kind of work, she said. I know you do. She looked at the building in front of her. The trauma wing windows, lit and operational, the people inside it doing what people inside hospitals did in the late afternoon, which was everything that needed doing and more. She thought about Denny Ashworth walking the corridor with his hand on the wall for balance, complaining about the food. She thought about the call light in room 14 that she'd seen from the access road on the first night, pulsing yellow through tilted blinds. She thought about what this floor had meant to her for 11 months, not as a place to hide exactly, but as a place to be fully present in the specific way that medicine demanded, where the stakes were immediate and the work was real and the validation came from the patient's numbers holding, not from anyone's opinion of who she was or what she'd done before. She was not going to leave that, but she was also not going to let the subcommittee report sit in a file folder and produce nothing because the people tasked with implementing it didn't understand what the clinical environment actually felt like from inside, or what it cost a woman to put her name on a complaint in a system she already suspected didn't want to hear it, or how those systems needed to be rebuilt from the specific ground up if they were going to hold what they were designed to hold. I'll talk to Harriet about the consulting structure, she said. She heard something in the pause on Slate's end that was not quite satisfaction, but was in the same general direction. I'll have someone send over the working group brief. Slate, she said. Yes. The women from the files, the ones pursuing civil action. Is there anything the working group does that specifically addresses the retroactive accountability gap? The fact that the original complaints were suppressed? That's on the agenda, he said. It's not simple. It involves statute of limitations, questions, and evidentiary standards for cases that were never formally investigated. But it's on the agenda. Make sure it stays there, she said. I will. She finished the sandwich after she hung up and sat in the parking lot for a while longer, watching the building, thinking about nothing specific and everything at once. She had come to Caldwell 11 months ago intending to be invisible. She had succeeded at that for 11 months, and then stopped succeeding in the most public possible way. And the story of that stop had unraveled 11 years of institutional machinery and produced a federal investigation and a criminal referral and 19 policy recommendations, and a working group that was going to spend 2 years trying to build something that should have existed all along. She had not planned any of that. She had planned to keep her head down and do the work, and let the rest of the world be the rest of the world. But the world had come to her, the way it sometimes came to people who were in the right position at the right moment. Not because they had arranged themselves there, but because they had simply refused to move when something told them to. She had stood still in that orientation hall, not because she was calm, but because she knew exactly what stillness cost and what it would produce. She had stood still on the level 2 corridor when security came for her because she was not done with the patient in the room she was standing outside. She had stood still in the stairwell with a text about forged signatures because stillness, in that moment, was the most powerful thing she had. She had been underestimated for most of her professional life, and she had learned over many years that being underestimated was a condition people imposed on you based on what they could see. What they couldn't see was their problem to reckon with. She had never needed them to see it. She had only needed to know it herself, and she had always known it herself, and that had been enough to get through everything that had needed getting through. The parking lot light came on above her car as the evening moved in. She started the engine. She had rounds tomorrow morning. She had the working group brief coming in the email she would read before sleep. She had a civil case moving through its process and a criminal proceeding moving through its own. And somewhere in Roanoke, Carla Odom was living her life and talking to a lawyer who was building something that had a real chance of mattering. And somewhere in Charlottesville, Denise Falconer was living hers. And 35 other women had heard from federal investigators for the first time about complaints they'd submitted years ago. And some of them had wept, and some of them had been silent, and some of them had said the same thing Carla Odom had said. I've been waiting for someone to find this. She pulled out of this parking lot. The thing about systems designed to make people invisible was that they worked. That was the most important and most uncomfortable truth of all of it. Not that the system had failed, but that it had functioned exactly as it was designed to function, efficiently and for a long time, against people who trusted it. The system had not broken down. It had been broken deliberately, from inside, by people who understood how to use institutional architecture as a weapon. You could not fix that by adding a policy. You could not fix it by suspending the people who had operated it, although that was necessary. You could not fix it by telling people to speak up, although that was also necessary. You fixed it by changing what the system rewarded and punished at every level, by building the kind of structural friction that made suppression difficult and documentation easy and accountability automatic rather than optional. That was not one person's work. It was not one investigation's work. It was the kind of work that took the kind of time that produced results you mostly didn't get to see. She knew how to do that kind of work. She had been doing it her entire career in one form or another, in rooms most people would never know existed, on floors where the lights stayed on through every hour of the night, in the specific, unglamorous, persistent way that was the only way it had ever actually gotten done. She drove home through the October evening. Behind her, through the amber light, the second floor of Caldwell Military Medical Center was lit and operational and full of people doing everything that needed doing. Somewhere on that floor, a call light came on. Someone answered it. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. Not through the loud moments, the convoy, the arraignment, the subcommittee report. Those were the visible part. The invisible part was every person who showed up the next morning and did the work anyway, who documented the things that needed documenting, who answered the call lights, who looked at an incomplete file and decided that looking away was no longer available to them. That was where the real thing lived. She had always known where to find it. The people who underestimated her had been looking in the wrong places. And because they'd been looking in the wrong places, they'd never seen what was coming until it was already there. That was not a story about her. That was a story about everyone who had kept doing the work in the dark, long before she arrived, and who would keep doing it long after. She hoped they knew how much it had mattered. She drove home, and the city went quiet around her. And somewhere in a federal building in Washington, a case file with 41 names moved forward, one more step toward the thing it was supposed to have been from the beginning. It wasn't perfect. It was never going to be perfect. But it was moving. And that was what she had come here to do.